Holy crap.
People persist in doubting the evidence.
Don't run and hide. Don't be afraid. Don't turn away any longer. The truth will set you free.
You're listening to Jimmy Church Fade to Black on the Dark Matter Radio Network.
We're turning all of our antennas towards Jimmy Church on Dark Matter Radio.
And now, your host, the captain of conspiracy, the prince of paranormal. This ain't your daddy's radio network show. This is Jimmy Church, Fade to Black.
Hey! All right. Yeah. Let's let this run. You know what? I don't think we have Space Boy tonight. I think he's on the road. Maybe they're listening in the car. You think they've got... Yeah. He's on the road. He posted today the picture of his navigation running in the car. 1,400 miles to Los Angeles. Space Boy, be safe. Cheryl, be safe. If you're listening. This is Fade to Black. All right, let's go. Fade to Black. We are back. Fade to Black, bespoke radio for the masses. Tuesday, August 5th, 217 days into the new year. We are live from the JP Motorsports Studios right here, sunny Burbank, California. For KJCR and the Dark Matter Radio Network, I am your humble host, Jimmy Church. Welcome to everybody listening all around the country, all around the world. The show's number one. It's amazing. Remember that first show? Oh, the memories. Yeah, man, we're 100 and something shows in. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. Big proud salute to the men and women in uniform all around the world fighting the good fight for us. Yes. Keith just texted. He said he could play the first show. No, you won't, sir. It's blackmail. It's blackmail. He wants something. All right, let's go. We got a great show today. You know, it's fun. I see these posts all the time. Jimmy says every show is going to be great. He says this show's great. Well, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Man, what the effort that we put in, we want them all to be great. We're done for you. I was talking to Tobias over the last couple of days, and one of the things we were talking about, he was asking me about, how the show took off and what does it feel like to be part of this. And, this is what I said to him. I said, Tobias, it's really honestly, I just do the show for me, the show that I think is the show that I would want to listen to, just a show for me. And if it catches fire, it's because other people get it. And that's what's most important. And you don't write books for other people. When you author a book, you're writing the book for yourself. You don't hope for this or hope for that, or because then you're going to write differently. You write for yourself, and if somebody else gets it, then you win. And that's what this is about. Isn't it what this is about? Bespoke radio for the masses. All right. Oh, got so much to do tonight. Again, another live show, 2 nights in a row from the UK. UK has taken over. I was looking at our our ratings for our website in the UK. You would not believe. I don't know what it is. What's going on over there in the UK and Fade to Black? But I got to tell you, we love our UK's friends. We love everybody over there. That is a crazy number. All right. Okay. Anyway, today, actress. I guess we can call her an actress. I'm not too sure. That's a misnomer. Tawny Katane is 53 years old, famous for one thing and one thing only, rolling around the hood of David Coverdale's Jaguar in that video, Here I Go Again with Whitesnake. And as everybody knows, I was partners with Rudy Sarzo for years in Sherman Oaks. We had a studio together, and Rudy was the bass player in Whitesnake for all those great hits, including that one. And the stories he had, well, wait a minute. I don't want to get in any trouble here. That's all I need is a phone call from Tawny. But Tawny was a lot of fun. All right, moving on. Actor John Saxon, 79 years old. Now, John Saxon, who is John Saxon? Unless you really know Bruce Lee, you probably don't know John Saxon. But John Saxon is a hero of mine. He's 79 years old today. Why is he my hero? John Saxon took a punch from Bruce Lee in the movie that's in the movie Enter the Dragon. There's a scene in the beginning of the movie. John Saxon goes up and he's got to fight Bruce Lee, and Bruce punches him in the no, or was it a kick? It might have been a kick. I thought it was a punch. Now my brain says kick. All I got to say is John Saxon flew back about 30 feet onto a table or through some people on the ground and didn't get up ever again because Bruce broke like 6 of his ribs. No joke. And Bruce wanted it to be real. Well, he made that real. I don't think John finished the movie after that. And it's a funny interview to hear John Saxon talk about that punch. And it was real. And John took it like a man. That's all I got to say. Love John Saxon. Love me some John Saxon. Happy birthday also to Fade to Black's very own Renee. Renee is 29 years old today. And might I add, never looked better. Happy birthday, Renee. All right. Got about 20 emails from Renee today, and all of it good. But anyway, happy birthday. Happy birthday, Renee. Twitter, @JChurchRadio. You want to hashtag DM RadioNet. TweetDeck is alive and well. The sandbox is cranking. It's a little lonely in there without Space Boy. And let me scroll through. No, I don't see me any Space Boy. All the Kens are here. Gordon Roop. Oh, Gordon's in the house. Ken. Backbeat's in the house. Michael Anderson. Sinnott, of course. MC Ryder. Leslie. Dale. Our normal cast of characters. Everybody's here. Welcome. All right. Let's go. Let's get this one cracking. I am ready. All right. Let's see. Go follow, like, subscribe, YouTube, all that stuff. You can also go over to what we do, and I've kind of neglected mentioning this on the last few shows. But Facebook, the fan page, is where to go. We tend to post there first. All right? Man, I WD-40'd the chair today. It was all good about 2 hours ago. What is going on? You can email throughout the show, Jimmy@JimmyChurchRadio.com. You can do so over on the website as well, on the contact page where we use non-NSA, specially encrypted servers. And don't forget about Contact in the Desert. We're winding this baby down. Today's Tuesday. Tomorrow's Wednesday. That's it. Tomorrow night, packing up. Friday morning, heading out to Contact in the Desert. Looking forward to it. All of the winners, Walter Lewis, Arturo Portillo, Shakira Bluesun, Rick Sinnott, Michael Rad, Jason Lamp, Ian Fowles, Kitty Brown. Those are our winners. We are going to have a great time. And like I said, I'm going to hand out video cameras, and those tickets weren't free. All right. Ebola virus. I've got some comments I'm going to make about this after the break. I got, over the last 2 days, these Ebola, this thing is just out of control. And I did get an email. I'm not going to read it on the air, but from a listener saying, Jimmy, look, man, honestly, your show has integrity. You're a cool guy. I listen every night, and you take me to play. And it was all of that. Okay, great. But he goes on to say, look, man, about Ebola, leave that to Alex Jones. Leave that kind of stuff because people listen to you. And you could potentially, you don't need to be part of that. And I agree. Except this is where I have the problem. I'm not other guys out there doing what I do. Well, I mean, guys that are on a microphone, like Alex Jones. Yeah, I get that. And those fears, in a general sense, are manufactured, are created from nothing, with no factual base. It's just out there purely for entertainment. I swear, because they know they're just BSing, on a microphone, total BS coming out. But I think all of them will admit, off mic, hey man, come on, I'm just having fun. Well, okay, but dude, at the expense of, scaring the crap out of people. But in this case, this is just like everything else with bird flu and avian this and anthrax that, and this is putting out general fear in the mass media, done for other reasons. These are factual based things. These are things that we know are going on, and that fear is generated from, when that whole avian bird flu, chicken this, bird feathered flu stuff, where you've got a handful of people here, there, infected, dying, Canada, everybody wearing face masks at LAX and every single plane landing everywhere around the world, all of that. That, where there was, it was a situation that we were aware of it, headed it off at the pass, but the fear was there, and flu vaccines, all of that. Well, here it's happening again, and so I get this email, and I tend to agree exactly what that email, the spirit of that email. I get it, I really do. But then you go and you have CNN, and I'm going to talk about this after the break. CNN comes out with all of these statistics about Ebola drug makers' stock going through the roof over the last couple of days. And it's exactly what I'm talking about. It's crazy that it just, when it's stuff like that, it's not fear that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the money play. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the money play. The money play. That's it. It's crazy, and you watch it. It's in front of you. It's happening in real time. That's what I'm referring to. It's crazy to be able to watch it, predict, and see it all happen in real time is absolutely hilarious. Okay, a couple of emails, and I'm going to get to the break. From Ben. A good time to watch the movie Andromeda Strain. How prophetic it was. Oh, no, wait. He says, a good time to watch the Andromeda Strain again. How prophetic it was. That was from Ben. Absolutely. And we left that off. Is that science fiction, Andromeda Strain? I mean, now it's, I don't know. What classification would that be? Because back then, I've seen that movie so many times. And I'm only referring to, it didn't make my list. And I don't know why, because I love that movie. Love Andromeda Strain. And you know what? I might watch that tonight after the show. All right, another email from Brian Anderson. Okay, now Brian sent me a really long email about Göbekli Tepe. And Brian, yes, it was a great email too, by the way. And it was an eye-opener. And so I peeled one sentence out. Check this out. Brian says, to the point, what if Göbekli Tepe is a record of time? Simply put, and the calendar, a time capsule on purpose. Now I stepped back after reading that and thought, that's a good one. That, my friends, is something to think about. Intentionally burying all of the animals, examples of humans and dress and other things, spanning time. Could it be? Now that was good, Brian. That's an A+ on your homework, my brother. I was stunned when I read your email. And like I said, I don't have a half hour to read the entire thing, but that in a nutshell is what he wrote about. Absolutely, 2 point and on point. So with that, let's take our first break. I'll come back and we'll pick up where we left off. This is Fade to Black Tuesday. Tonight, Tobias Churton, live from the UK. We are going to do the life of Aleister Crowley, or is it Crowley? Crowley? Aleister Crowley. We're going to start from the end and work backwards. Jimmy style. We're going to get educated. This is Fade to Black, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Follow us on Twitter right now at JChurchRadio. Hashtag DMRadioNet. Come hang out with us. I'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Jimmy Church Fade to Black on the Dark Matter Radio Network.
What's up, revolutionaries? It's me, Jimmy Church. Do you have an IRS or state tax issue? Well, I did, and I called national tax experts. My problems were fixed, done, fini, and man, I got to tell you, it was a relief. National Tax Experts are a recognized tax office that services clients in all 50 states. It doesn't matter where you live. Give them a call. I'm telling you, they take the time to understand each and every client's individual financial status as well as their financial goals. And that's exactly what you need, my brother, when you're taking on the evil 3-letter. So, seriously, give them a call today at 1-877-909-5444. Again, 1-877-909-5444. Or go check out their website, www.nattaxexperts.com. That's NATTAXEXPERTS.com. Tell them Jimmy sent you.
This is KJCR at JimmyChurchRadio.com.
On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
All right, Fade to Black. We are back. Let's get this one cracking, and I'm not kidding. I'm not. Let's get it going. Man, I'm fired up. It got me some Aleister Crowley coming up. Crowley. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. That's what you want to do. I'll be hanging out all night. I'll try to keep up. Tonight, Tobias Churton. Tomorrow night, Norio Hayakawa. Norio, OG, man. OG. If I could live the life that Nori has led. Oh, man. Half of that. Oh. Tomorrow night, Norio Hayakawa. Okay, a couple of things. Yeah, Gordon, I was just looking. Gordon Roop, I did have this. Gordon, you got to give me a chance to do the show before you say something like that. So I expect an apology in Twitter to pop up in just a second. Gordon wrote an article today that I retweeted, and I will retweet it again. Gordon, if you want to go ahead and post it now, that'll save me from tweeting and talking at the same time. That is rather dangerous here. But he wrote an article today about Ted Nugent. And Ted Nugent going whack. Ted was always whack, but in a good way. I'm a big Ted guy, big Ted fan, and well, I'm a fan of Ted's guitar playing, and certainly his old guitar playing. I mean, there's nothing finer than Double Live Gonzo. Could you imagine hearing? I'll just say it, man. I'll say it. Could you imagine Nori saying that on Coast to Coast? Man, love me some Double Live Gonzo. San Antonio. Could you imagine? Hey. George picking up the axe and playing some Great White Buffalo on the air. Hibernation. Anyway. And why didn't Ted just stop and just let history play out? You know, you don't need to go south. You don't need to go all Republican and everything that or whatever and do that. He was always outspoken, but in a funny way. It was a funny thing. It was funny. He was a fast-talking, ripping guitar player. And lately, I don't get Ted. I don't. I'm not playing any of the new stuff, man. I'll just go back to Weekend Warriors, man. I'll go back to 1978 and not have to worry about anything because that is Ted. Ted, I don't know what happened. So anyway, Gordon wrote an excellent article on that. Gordon, go ahead and retweet that. I'll retweet your retweet, and we'll get that going. Pretty cool. Okay, also today, popped up on page 6 of the New York Times. Yes, the Malibu deep underwater base. Oh, man, hit the New York Times. I don't know if anybody caught that. And, of course, it has spread out from there. Michael Luckman, he's a promoter, he's a writer, he's an author. He's also the director of the New York Center for Extraterrestrial Research. He contacted me probably 2 months ago, 3 months ago. We've had a lot of contact. Good guy, smart guy, sharp guy. And he wanted to help with getting a vessel together and some other stuff and extended an olive branch to us, anything that he could do to help us with the research with the deep underwater base. He was there, and so forth. And then he called me. I'm gonna say now it was about 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, and said, Jimmy, look, man, this is what we're gonna do. It's like, okay, we're gonna do a UFO Malibu deep underwater base Woodstock. And what do you think, man? Underwater speakers, laser light show over the base, light everything up, and a concert on the beach, and it'll be the biggest thing ever, and let's do this. I was like, okay, Mike, whoa. That's pretty ambitious. So anyway, he went forward with it. And today at this concert, I don't want to say anything premature. In advance of what Mike is working on, he can make his announcements, well, through me and through the show, but as time warrants. But he's putting it together, and pretty long list of celebs. I think he's got David Bowie, which would be cool. Mick Jagger, he's invited them. Yoko Ono, Shirley MacLaine. I think Russell Crowe is on the list, and pretty fantastical just endeavor. So there you go. It's going to be going on. And so it made the New York Times, and then a few other websites have grabbed onto it. And so we will see. We will see if this comes together. I think it will. He's a pretty ambitious promoter and knows what he's doing. So there you go. I've received a bunch of email about that today and comments and other people in the media asking me about it. So I said I would reserve comment until tonight's show. There you go. Okay? All right. UFO Woodstock out at the Malibu Deep Underwater Base. Okay, let's see. Where was I? Where was I? Oh, okay. Man, I've got so much to do tonight. Oh, man. Oh. Okay. This from CNN Money, which is, this is the headline. Ebola drug makers' stock rises. Shares of a Vancouver-based company working on a drug to treat the infectious disease surged nearly 40% last week. Shares of Tecmira, which were up by as much as 26% at one point yesterday. Meanwhile, check this out. Shares of BioCryst, that's BIOCRYST, Bio, short for biocrystal meth, I think. BioCryst Pharmaceuticals, BCRX, another small biotech firm working on a drug that could be used to treat Ebola, went up yesterday as well. Now, both of these companies, have interest with United States development at the government level and funding. Pretty strange. And again, I'm not part of this fear. I'm just saying this is the money play. You know, the guys that are trading that stuff, man, it's a dark, that's the dark underbelly of things that you and I never should know anything about. If you're going to trade stock, you know how you trade stock. You get your little IRA and let somebody else deal with it and get your envelope once a month and don't open it. Just throw it in the drawer and not care. Don't make any changes and hope for the best when you turn 65. You know, that's how you do it. You don't want to get in that world where you're trading on fear of Ebola, of some crazy outbreak, which is exactly what is going on. Nuts. Oh, man. And then you back that up with this. Donald Trump tweeted today. This is Donald Trump, the official Donald Trump tweeted today. Ebola patient will be brought to the U.S. in a few days. I'm sorry, this tweet came out 2 days ago. In a few days. Now, I know for sure that our leaders are incompetent. Keep them out of here. End quote. Now, we all know Donald is outspoken. But all of this kind of stuff, and I hearken back to the email I referred to earlier in the show, which is, I'm not part of this fear. I'm not. He is. And the ability to flash headlines like this across the country or across the world instantaneously, that fuels the fear. And that's it. Which is, what is fueling the fear? Here, let me pull the microphone up here. Right here. What fuels the fear? Money. It ain't me. It's the money. And never forget that. All right. Good thing, though, Israel's pulled out of Gaza. That nightmare is slowed down for a couple of days. Good for the people of Gaza. Man, I just can't imagine. You know, this is the thing, and I always look at it like this. You know, Gaza is so small, Gaza Strip. And here in the San Fernando Valley, we have about, I don't know, man, would Israel fit in the San Fernando Valley? Probably. I don't know, maybe a little bigger. Maybe it's a lot bigger. I don't know. I haven't checked. Okay, so don't bust my balls. But if somebody in Studio City started lobbing missiles over into Burbank, 2 miles away, 3 miles away, what would we do? Or vice versa. We're lobbing missiles and then somebody crosses the street, literally, and invades our little town with a bunch of tanks because we're lobbing something. I mean, it's that kind of skirmish in a very small, tight area. I just can't imagine with children and my children and everything else what is truly going down over there. I can't. I'm just glad to see it come to an end. All right, so that's it. I think we are ready to go with Tobias. Tomorrow night, Norio Hayakawa will be in. OG gangster from the earliest days of Area 51. Bob Lazar lives in New Mexico now, and it has been stirring up so much trouble lately, and he's a great friend. And so tomorrow night will be a full night with Norio. And I'm not going to actually say what we're going to be talking about tomorrow night specifically on a couple of things, because the guy that we're going to be talking about part of the time is just a straight hornet's nest sticker with stick. And I don't want to cause any trouble, but Norio has, so I'm going to put it on him tomorrow night. All right, so that's it. We come back after the break. Tobias Churton live from the UK. It is Fade to Black. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Shoot me an email right now to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. I'm excited. It's a full night of Aleister Crowley. Back right after this. Stay with us, everybody.
Way out here, we listen to Jimmy Church on the Dark Matter Radio Network.
Dark matter.
Dark Matter, Dark Matter, Dark Matter, Dark Matter.
You're listening to Fade to Black
On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
¿Qué tal, mis amigos? Yo soy Mario Carson, el tiburón, y los invito para que escuchen a mi buen amigo Jimmy Church Radio. ¡Claro que sí!
Oi, oi, I'm Reese Evans. You're listening to Jimmy Church. This is Revolution. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution is on radio. Ciao.
Everybody, welcome back. This is Fade to Black, bespoke radio for the masses. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. All right, listen, let's get this one cracking. You want to follow us right now on Twitter at JChurchRadio, hashtag DMRadioNet. Go hang out in the sandbox. We're kind, we're friendly. Go hang out. I've got my tweet deck open right here to my left. All right, if you got any questions or any comments on tonight's program, with our conversation with Tobias, post it there. Shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. You can also do that over on the contact page on our website, jimmychurchradio.com, if you want to pierce the veil of the producers. Make it good. Make it smart. All right. We are only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Let's get this one cracking. I'm ready. Tobias Churton is Britain's leading scholar of Western esotericism, appointed honorary fellow, School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Exeter University in 2005. Tobias holds a master's degree in theology from Oxford. Apart from his influential contribution to religious television and his achievements as a composer and a lecturer, Tobias's many books includes a biography of Elias Ashmole and Aleister Crowley, the biography, the definitive work on Crowley. It's actually Crowley. I'm sure Tobias is going to correct me a few times tonight on the pronunciation. He first came to public notice with the 1987 Channel 4 production Gnostics. Long before Dan Brown scored a hit with the Da Vinci Code, Tobias Churton introduced a popular audience to the authentic world of the esoteric. Busy on his 17th published book, Churton is today internationally recognized for his insightful books on the esoteric, spiritual history, philosophy. Accessible and scholarly, Churton's works address believers and doubters alike. His current book is The Beast in Berlin, a biographical history of Aleister Crowley's activities in Berlin from 1930 to 1932 as Hitler was rising to power. And I would like to humbly welcome to the program right now, Tobias Churton. Tobias, live from London. It's 3:30 in the morning there. Thank you for staying up late with us. And how are you doing?
I'm looking at the stars and everything's fine. It's a great delight to be on your show.
I have to thank you. I have to we're going to jump into a couple of things at the very front of the interview. First thing, and again, this is just a conversation between friends. Wherever this conversation starts is where it starts, and where it ends and where it ends. But we were talking during the break about a couple of different subjects, and one of them was the pronunciation of Aleister Crowley, and you're saying I'm wrong.
I'm afraid so. Yes. It would appear you may have got your pronunciation from Ozzy Osbourne's famous song, but I wouldn't send you to Ozzy for instruction in Aleister Crowley personally. It's Crowley as in holy,
Crowley,
not Crowley as in foully.
And that's what Aleister said, correct?
Perhaps he wrote a limerick or poem. Short poem, how to pronounce his own name. So we have it from the master, as it were.
Totally interesting because, and to bring up Ozzy with something like this, but Aleister has influenced a couple of generations now not only because of Ozzy, and of course there is an influence there. I mean, he influences a lot of people, but he's probably more famous today than he was when he was alive. And why do you think the fascination is there for us today with Aleister?
In many ways, it's a kind of mystery that Crowley has suffered resurrection in a culture which to him would have been in many ways alien and in many ways familiar. But it is a remarkable fact. When he died in 1947, I think Time magazine said, well, that's the end of that, thank goodness, and we'll never hear of him again. And that was the general view, that this difficult figure, this carbuncle of a man who stands out in his own era so uniquely, would be forgotten because it was thought that the things that bothered him, that he was dealing with, were of no great interest to the future. They would have no place in the future. Because of his interest in magic, for example. Well, magic was superseded by science, wasn't it? No need for all that stuff. Belief in spirits, very odd stuff. So in that sense, he should have been written off. But there has been a curious reaction to the world of materialist science. And I believe that Crowley's proper place is within, for us in our time, is as part of a reaction against materialism. I think that's the more profound basis of the interest. The other interest in Crowley is sensationalist. He led a life that can be presented very easily as an extraordinarily extreme and sensational life, although I think that is hugely exaggerated.
What I'd like to do in a weird way, I would like to start at Crowley's end, because and then sort of work backwards, if you don't mind, because
Sure.
For Crowley, and I go Crowley, holy Crowley, with Crowley, and I will do it throughout the interview now. So thank you for that. With Crowley, I think that he attracted a lot of his friends because of his money. That's my opinion. That you have plenty of friends when you have money. When you're broke, you find out really who your friends are, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And in the end, he was just a guy in his later years living in a halfway house in London, broke, desperate for money, did the lawsuit over his poetry and so forth, that famous lawsuit. But in the end, he was just a broken man who had a child who actually, I think he actually, if there was ever any real love coming out of that guy, probably happened then. But that's how it ended for him, and you're absolutely right. He could have just gone away at that point. But how did he get to the broken man that he was in the very end in London?
Well, Jimmy, I would dispute fundamentally the notion that Aleister Crowley was in any way broken, bent, warped, or had been destroyed in his essential spirit by the end of his life. He stood tall right up to the end. He was. I think it was said of William Blake that Blake was dignified by poverty. Certainly, Crowley was very poor when he died, but it should be. He had, I think, £450 cash in a box under his bed when he died. Now that was collected from the members of his organization in California, and he wouldn't touch it because that money had been sent to him specifically for the publication of a book, and he wouldn't lay into that at all. Now, if he was a broken and desperate man, he'd have had his fingers in it and thrown his way on whatever was supposedly keeping him going. Crowley was not destitute. He wasn't on the streets. He was at a boarding house,
right?
Set up by the man who invented Alcoholics Anonymous, if I remember right, which is a sort of to help alcoholics in England, famous organization. Crowley stuck out like a sore thumb there. He didn't particularly like living there at all. That was where he just happened to be there for 2 years.
Well,
so it was not a broken man.
Well, I don't mean broken. Well, no, actually, I do in a sense.
You do, don't you?
Broken as in financial, but I mean broken as in spirit, where before he was just running amok in Italy and crazy thoughts and really influencing people, and where he ended up in London, he didn't have that power, that pull that he had from before. That's what I refer to as broken.
Again, I think when Crowley was at his most famous in the 1920s, early 20s particularly, notorious, I should say, rather than famous.
Right.
It wasn't a happy fame for him at all. He was probably also at his least effective, because with that fame came a notoriety which completely damaged all of his programs for what he wanted to promote in the world. So fame didn't do him any good at all. Whereas in his later years, a more modest existence in various parts of London and eventually in Hastings on the south coast of England, he actually quietly got on with his work, wrote several books and additional poetry, and started to develop a reputation as an expert in occultism, purely and simply as that. So a famous Cambridge Lady Don, came to visit him in Hastings for advice on books. So he was regarded as a kind of retired scholar. So the myth of the broken down old mage is just that. It's a myth. It's a useful myth because everybody would like the idea that he was naughty, he was bad, and he suffered for it.
Right. And so hence the question is an important one then. You're saying that the myth is completely wrong, and the myth is what people like myself are fed.
The myth is what most people take to be the story, the history. He was aware of this. He had a book written by P.R. Stevenson in 1930 called The Legend of Aleister Crowley. And it is really how that legend came about and how much damage it had done. So, yes, people have heard the legend, even on the internet. Now, most of the things that are said about Crowley, by the vast percentage, are simply historically inaccurate perversions, the kind of thing that would be said about a heretic by an inquisitor. You want to destroy this man's reputation. First of all, you destroy his personality, you destroy his beliefs, you destroy his true story, you denigrate his writings, you denigrate his art. Now, that's the angle I'm taking in the new book, is I'm looking at Aleister Crowley as, in fact, the only British artist to have his own exhibition in the Weimar Republic, Berlin, just before Hitler took over. So I'm resurrecting the truth of Crowley as an artist, as he was. Nina Hamlet, Nancy Cunard, many artists have said that this man's an artist. If we see him as an artist, then perhaps we will forgive the excesses, because artists are always forgiven their excesses. You know, how can you be an artist if you don't experiment, try things out? Now, see Crowley as an artist rather than as the demon of black magic, and you start to get closer to the real man.
Now, before we move on with that kind of answer, which I find almost dramatic, you have a degree in theology, as was presented in the intro. How and now coming from that background, where did you made a right turn somewhere, okay? You went off the road, so to speak.
I love that. Yes,
I
certainly made a right turn. Yeah, there are two ways of saying that. One is I studied theology with a view to the priesthood when I was 18, on the basis of my ancestor, Archdeacon Rafe Churton, who said the only thing worth contending for is the truth. And that is my position. I'd studied theology because my interest was the truth. My position regarding Aleister Crowley is precisely that, is to arrive at the truth. What I found when I was an undergraduate, a friend lent me a book, The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, and I read it, and I found great insight and wisdom and a huge amount of value, literary value and spiritual value in the book. And I couldn't square that reception with the image of Crowley. For example, if I went to the local library and I wanted to take out Crowley's biography by John Simons, it had a warning pasted on it, not to be taken out by people under the age of 18 years. And really saying this book could damage your health, So I couldn't square these two things up at all. So that I became interested on that sense. It was also obvious to me, reading the spirit, getting into the spirit of Crowley's writing, that he was a Gnostic. And of that, this was a subject we had to study as theologians. And therefore, he's a heretic. Again, if we see him as a heretic, we can understand his position much better with regard to the dominant religion of the Western world. So, yes, I couldn't have done this without having been a theologian. I wouldn't have had much to contribute, I don't think, without that understanding. He himself knew the Bible better than any fundamentalist I've ever met.
He certainly did, and I do want to talk about his childhood, but again, we're kind of moving backwards. But I'm having a problem squaring up with what you're saying too. Almost, are you saying that we have completely misunderstood Aleister Crowley, and that he had a bright side? You're not calling him a bright ray of sunshine, certainly.
Well, I would. He called himself that. I think in a trial where he was suing a publisher for having denigrated his reputation, Constable and Company, the judge said, "Why do you call yourself 666?" He said, "Well, it's an esoteric number, but it means little sunshine. You can call me little sunshine." He saw it as a symbol, as a solar symbol. He himself was a very fun-loving, humorous, positive person to be around. And he used to say, never dull where Crowley is. And people of more daring intellect probably, or artistically more sensitive, enjoyed his company. In fact, Nina Hamlet said the trouble with Crowley was he hung out with too many ordinary people who sort of brought him down. But Crowley felt he had to speak to anyone who contacted him. So was Mussolini wrong? Well, history would suggest so.
Oh man!
You want Benito as your friend? I would say it's a fairly risky business.
Okay, I'm forwarding all email to Tobias.
No,
listen, because the comments. I mean, it was direct, and the media. I mean, absolutely flamed everything about Crowley. And his stint in Italy, threw him out of the country, and said some very dramatic things in the press. Things that that were so bad and salacious. I have trouble comment directly what those were on this program, which I don't have a problem with. But it is dark. I mean, very, very dark accusations. Now, he didn't go to court. He wasn't proven guilty of anything. But he was certainly kicked out of the country with a long list of stuff. And he left the country with his tail between his legs. So was Mussolini, did any of that stuff go down in the villa?
Well, he was living with two women.
Right. Well, I mean, it's
some would say that is either to be envied or a folly. It depends on the women and yourself. They were well over 21. They knew exactly what they were doing, and in many ways, he was looking after them. He saved them from having to work, for example, for a living. One of them was a childminder by trade,
right.
from a very poor family. That was Ninette Fro. And Leah, his main Scarlet Woman, as he would jokingly call his big loves, who played a part in his life, spiritual life particularly. She was just madly in love with him. She'd met him in New York, and it was love at first sight. And I remember a lovely letter she wrote to him in 1919. She said, "I've always loved you. I will always love you. Whatever you do, I will love you." These were two women who loved him and were very jealous of each other because they both loved him, and he'd have to try and hold them apart, because they'd have cat fights. Nothing more. I suppose you could find similar stories in any artist's life or a musician's life. Nothing there that ought to frighten people too much. Now, as for the magic that was practiced, which was a sexual magic, I don't know whether Benito Mussolini was an expert on esoteric magical practices. I know most of the people who comment on this certainly are not. Crowley was a man in love with God. I don't think sex for him was the same as sex for other people. And that sounds like special pleading, but everything in his life supports the idea that he was not some wicked pornographer. I remember once in Berlin, a girl brings back her lesbian girlfriend back to his flat, and he kicked them out. He said, "I won't have filth in my flat." Now, by that, he didn't mean he didn't approve of lesbianism at all, but he wasn't interested in sex orgies simply for physical stimulation. He wasn't holding up in a kind of sex palace. For him, sexual energy was a divine energy, and he had views completely at variance with the conservative traditions of his time, and especially, obviously, of somebody like a fascist dictator like Mussolini. But I really think that Mussolini's big beef against Crowley was I suspect that Mussolini thought that Crowley was spying for the British government, or possibly for the French government, and because he was also a member of a Freemasonic organization, a fringe Masonic organization, some would say.
Yes.
By definition. Mussolini was at that time concerned with arresting Freemasons in Italy. And the British consul in Palermo in Sicily, where Crowley was also a member of a Masonic order which Crowley was associated with, which is the Rites of Memphis and Mizraim. His name is McBean, who's the Palermo. So there's a lot more to that story than, Crowley was kicked out because sex, I think, was the ostensible reason.
I just saw 100,000 jaws drop. This is a good spot to break. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to Fade to Black with Tobias Churton, live out of London, England. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Hashtag DMRadioNet. Also, shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com if you have any questions for Tobias. And we'll be back right after this. Stay with us, everybody.
Hi, everybody. This is Rob Halford, the Metal God, on jimmychurchradio.com.
What's up? My name's Brian Taylor, Ninja Badass Extraordinaire, and this is jimmychurchradio.com.
JJCR, in your face.
jimmychurchradio.com. On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
Back, Fade to Black, bespoke radio for the masses. I am your host, Jimmy Church. We are with Tobias Churton, live out of London, UK. Well, you're not in London proper. We'll get to that in a second. Shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. hashtag DMRadioNet. We are only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Now, we were talking, Tobias, before the break about Mussolini and his accusations. And it wasn't just on, and again, the definition of legend and legendary, two different things. And the legend of Aleister is one thing, and the truth is another. But Mussolini and the media not only talked about the sex parties that he was having at the villa, but there were accusations of different types of sacrifices going on. That was certainly put out there in the media. They were labeling him with everything they could to get him to make the justification of kicking him out of the country. I think was the goal, and it worked. But what about the darker side? That the blood rituals and goats and there was accusations of children and sacrifices and so forth. Are you saying all of this was just inaccurate and, well, quite frankly, just lies by the media?
Well, when I wrote the biography of Crowley, I went into as much detail as I possibly could on the existing documentation. And I found that, if one was dealing with some sort of wild psychopathic personality, I certainly would have felt bad. But that was not the impression I was getting at all. And I don't know where the blood stuff comes from. A lot of those stories are exaggerated or were made up. One of the women who was used as a source in that. Actually, there's something that needs to be said, actually. We're talking about a man who lived 70 years. He was in Sicily for 1920 to 23. And most of the stories are about a period which for him was a retirement after being in America throughout the First World War, when he worked as many things, but one thing he was an intelligence asset, giving information on German subversion in New York and other parts of America. German directly sponsored sabotage and subversion in the United States during World War I, which we're celebrating this week on the continent. That period wore him down terribly. He was very poor throughout the time, and he struggled to exist through that period and was very often cold and somewhat destitute. And as they say, dependent on the kindness of strangers. He had a hard time, 1915 to 1919. And so the period in Sicily was for him a retirement. So he was taking it easy. But one thing he was doing was experimenting, particularly into the connection between psychotropic drugs, as we call them, psychotropic or entheogens, and this whole relation to consciousness and magic. He was a student of psychology. A lot of what he was doing was a fearless, extraordinary. You've got to remember, this is a man who had for a time the highest climbing record in the world of mountaineering. He's a brilliant mountaineer. This is a fearless pioneer sort of man. He was prepared to go into his soul, into his mind, with the same spirit that he went up the mountains in the Karakorams in northern India, the Tibetan border. So this is a fearless man. Now, in pursuit of actual knowledge of magic, people have read magic, people romanticize about magic, but actually no scientific work of any great depth had ever been done on magical ritual. Does it work? Do any of these things work? Can the mind be raised to levels where they can contact other forms of intelligence? He wanted to know through direct experience. And I think a great deal of his experimentation, which would have frightened people then, as it probably does now, just even to hear about it for some people is a bit too much. And I understand that. And Crowley's not for those people. He's a spiritual pioneer. He's as you said, you talk about taking a turn that was unique. Crowley was pioneering. I think he's still a pioneering figure. I don't know these stories about goats and that have anything more to them than Crowley jesting and having a laugh, because he was a great joker. But I also happen to think that he went a bit mad for about 3 or 4 months in that period, he'd taken too many substances. And I think he had a very bad time. And he got himself addicted to heroin. Not as some sort of recreational drug. He'd been recommended by his family doctor, Dr. Batty Shaw of Wimpole Street, London, who'd said he had terrible problem with bronchial asthma. And this is 1920. And they said the only sure cure, the only thing that's really going to work, Mr. Crowley, is heroin, which it was prescribed to him for the control of what could have been a terminal condition. But he was also interested again in the effects of it generally. So Cefalù for him was a period of experimentation. He compressed into that time, I suppose, the entire experience of the Western world in the 1960s into psychedelia, well ahead of his time. But that's where he was into a psychedelic mode of thinking for about two of those 3 years, and intensely for about 6 months. And yes, I think he went a bit over the top on occasion, judging by his diaries. But his diaries, again, shouldn't be taken too literally. He wrote in, especially at that period, he wrote in rather grandiose style. It's not my favorite period of Crowley's contribution. The sad thing is nearly all his experimental write-ups and papers that he compiled were destroyed, apparently, by British customs. So, unfortunately, the fruits of a lot of that experimentation are not available to say, well, yes, he did all that, but look at the results, Right. But people now in universities across America are now doing the same kinds of experimenting. Under laboratory conditions.
What's the foundation then for these accusations? They seem to be based on fact.
Well, I think. Well, no, I don't think they are based on fact. They're based on hearsay. For example, the Betty May, who provided the first revelations in the British press, was taken off the ship as she got back from Sicily after the death of her husband, Raoul Loveday, and she got drunk by the reporters, and paid money for the story, which they then dressed up. I saw the letter she wrote to Aleister saying, I'm so sorry about this, I didn't mean it, and I didn't say half of these things anyway. And Raoul Loveday's own sister, the man who died in Cefalù, I found her letters to Crowley's first major biographer, John Simons, saying that she did not blame Crowley for Raoul's death, for Raoul was a nickname of Loveday's death. She recognized that he had, in fact, Crowley would have saved his life if Loveday had listened. He was told not to drink the local water, spring water, in Sicily, and he did, and he died of enteric fever as a result, which was a tragedy for Crowley, and he knew that it was a disaster for him, for his work. He was trying to set up a kind of what we'd now say would be a kind of new age ashram he wanted to build. I've seen his designs for it. He wanted people to come, especially, funnily enough, to deal with drug addiction. He believed that through his spiritual discipline, he could get people off the heaviest drugs. That was what he was trying to do with Betty May and Loveday, who'd been leading a sort of, again, I'd say, a 60s psychedelic lifestyle in London and Paris, and got themselves hooked. And Crowley was getting them off, not on, off the, trying to get them off.
Well,
but, I think it'd be nice if we'd move the conversation slightly into a broader perspective.
Which is exactly where I'm going with this. I mean, with Crowley and this image that has been painted of him up to this point, certainly was part of his own doing too. And the words, the use of things like, calling himself the beast, and he wanted this image, and so he got the image, and if some of his close inner circle is out there also spreading the myth, spreading the legend, it certainly didn't hurt what he was trying to do. Why would he himself want this image of this bad guy? And I mean, there's other comments. I mean, there's other things we could point to, but certainly it seemed like he wanted to fester this.
Well, I don't think he wanted to be seen as a bad guy. I think he wanted to He wasn't afraid of the decadent concept of épater les bourgeois, shock the conceited, shock the boring middle classes who don't see any further than the bank balance and their investments and the material goods. He wanted to shock a complacent Western Europe into something like a spiritual awareness. That was what he was aiming at. He wanted to liberate man with all the fervor of Tom Paine.
Yes, he did.
Who, of course, was kicked out of England for being a social danger. And Crowley did represent a danger to a straight society, because what he wanted was a society of free individuals. Free individuals. That's what he stood for. Not a penitentiary. A social system which kept people locked up strictly in class and roles. And you've got to think of the world at that period, what he was dealing with. His viewpoint was very modern. England was a class-ridden society where people's whole destiny was decided according to where they were born to a very, very, very great degree. He wanted but he didn't look to socialism or communism for a panacea. He looked to he wanted a comprehensive spiritual doctrine, but he knew that doctrine's profoundest enemies of his doctrine, as he saw it, were the churches. Whether Catholic or Protestant. He recognized that they wanted control of man's spiritual life, and the question he posed was, they've had it for 2,000 years, and what have they done with it?
Right. Yeah. And this is a good point. Now let's back up to his childhood, because now we've set up the end, and now we're going to get to Berlin. I do want to talk about his time in the United States too, which you brought up earlier. Now let's back up. His family, and and you mentioned, I don't want to let this get away from us. You mentioned that he was broke while he was in the United States. And that is fascinating to me because of the money that his family had left to him, and I didn't realize he ran out of it so early. So let's back up. Now, his dad, very well. He was a minister. He
was a self-financing minister of religion of the Plymouth Brethren. Yes, paid entirely for himself.
By himself. His family beer, right? The bottom line.
No, that's another of the myths.
Okay.
That
really?
Crowley's father was a brewer. No, this is not true. His great uncle was a famous owner of several very large breweries in the south of England, but his father didn't work for a living at all. He was a gentleman who lived on family money. He had investments in engineering works in this country and in Holland, and he lived on his shares, and he lived a very nice lifestyle indeed. But his father was not a brewer, nor did he invent, as John Simon said, a beer engine or anything like this. This is not true.
Okay.
Crowley came from sort of upper class but exclusive social setting. He was not allowed to play with other children outside of the sect. He was not allowed to read popular literature. The Plymouth Brethren were a Plymouth Brother in that period would have regarded today's most avid fundamentalist biblical Christian as probably damned for hell for not being strict enough.
Right, for being too liberal. Right.
Too liberal, yeah.
Now, and so I guess what I'm saying is this. Well, not I guess. This is exactly what I'm saying. The family, Aleister's parents, and his mother, too, was Plymouth to the bone as well. Yes. They used family money to finance their ministry. That's what I was referring to. And yes. Aleister followed his dad around and really looked up to his dad, and also followed Scripture and his parents' point of view. That would be correct, right? Very strict religious upbringing.
He felt he had no reason that nobody could be more right than his father. Mm-hmm. He worshipped his father, but he was never close to him in an emotional way. His father had a certain distance. His father was really quite old by the time Aleister, his only son, surviving son, was born. And but they never had the closeness. But Aleister wanted that, of course. And his mother was particularly distant and censorious. They loved him well enough, but it was a Victorian upbringing, and children's place was there, and the parents were rather apart. But at the same time, he was admitted into family conversations, which were almost always about religion. No wonder he almost asphyxiated on doctrines of, the whole historic doctrines of the Bible. So he had Christianity sort of, as it were, in surfeit. You can perhaps have too much of it. I don't know. But in his case, there was a kind of a growing asphyxiation, and he associated it more and more, especially after his father died. This was the key event of his life when he was
11, I think.
Yeah, 11.
Yes,
he was 11 years old, and the brethren were into sort of new kind of healing methods, and they put him on Count Matte's electromagnetic something or other. He got tongue cancer. He should have had his, it should have been operated on. But like so many, they thought, no, we can do this with prayer. We don't want, they had the finest surgeon in the land could have done it. But they said, no, we'll do it through prayer and this electroplated, newfangled concept. Crowley regarded them as having murdered his father through their religious bigotry. And I think that was a key moment in his development, when he realized that that you can have a spiritual perspective that's so wrong that it kills people through all the good reasons, for whatever justification. I mean, there was the brethren had a quote for every possible occasion, and he was terribly used to that.
And of course, his mother and father wouldn't, even if Aleister was outspoken about this at that time. First off, he was a kid, but they wouldn't have listened to him. They were steadfast in their belief. And
well, his mother regarded her son as a sort of perpetual trial, because he would take the mickey out of her. As after his father's death, he started using his intellect, and she began to realize that her son wasn't reading from the same hymn book as she was, and she was the one who gave him the name the Beast. When he was asked why do you call yourself the Beast, he says, well, my mother called me the Beast. It's a name that stuck. She said he was the Beast. She said that he'd obviously been sent by the enemies of heaven to taunt her. He was too much of a challenge for his mother, you see. So she ended up putting him in a kind of school that you only read about in Dickens fiction, a school run by today would be regarded as a child, not a molester, but the other abuser, a child abuser, somebody who got pleasure from actually torturing the bodies and minds of children. And this man, Champney, who ran the school in Cambridge, was only closed down because Crowley contacted his father's brother, who was a scientist, and said, for God's sake, save me from this school. And his uncle had the place investigated, and Champney was dismissed. And after that, his mother and her brother, who was the other bête noire of the story. If you really want the Beast is actually Uncle Tom, Crowley's uncle, who came in and started trying to mastermind Crowley's future. But the fact of the matter is that this went on, and Crowley was all set to become a diplomat in the British diplomatic service. That was his main ambition. And he went to Cambridge on the personal recommendation of the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. So he came from a strong family in Croydon in south of London. The Crowley name was famous because of a substantial brewery in Croydon, and he had social advantages. But he wasn't an Anglican, and when he went up to Cambridge, he didn't attend the chapel services. He had special dispensation, so he was rather outside of the mainstream of society, even though he was quite wealthy.
What happened throughout that period of after his father's death and entering Cambridge? Did his religious views swing one way or the other?
Well, his main interest was science, straightforward science. Chemistry was his great interest. His other great interest was chess, and of course his overriding interest was mountaineering. Those were his great interests. He wasn't particularly interested in religion as such. He didn't want to be a priest or a theologian. He didn't want to follow his father as a preacher. He wanted his main interest was science, especially the new science of psychology. And I mean, at that time, Trinity College, Cambridge, which is a marvelous historic college, the Prime Minister had been there, and Crowley got to know the members of the Psychical Research Society, which began at Trinity College, Cambridge at that time, who were investigating scientifically the claims of mediums.
Well,
Crowley was fascinated by this.
Exactly. So, up to that point, I guess what I'm saying is everything that he believed in until he was 11 years old and his father's death, everything that he believed in, everything that he respected as far as the scriptures goes and the Plymouths and so forth, changed radically. In that he and I'm asking you, you're the biographer, but his views changed radically. Everything that he looked at leading up into Cambridge would have been the exact opposite of what he believed before his father's death, and that's what I'm saying. He took a right
I'm not
turn.
I'm not sure we have any evidence to suggest that. We have no diaries or letters of his from that period at all. So how his thoughts changed, we've only got his own word to say. And in his confessions, the feeling is in fact that in many ways his views didn't change all that fundamentally. He became what's the word? You know, when people have been sort of brainwashed and then they're taken out of it. Deprogrammed.
Deprogrammed.
He deprogrammed himself. He got to know, he had a tutor who took him to the south coast of England for a holiday and introduced him to girls and cards. And I think that's about as heretical as he was getting in that period. He took an interest in girls in his late teens. We wouldn't think that was surprising today, would we?
Right.
But his mother and uncle were shocked. He went out with girls and he played cards.
Right.
Games. These had been forbidden. So he began to realize that if you went against the upbringing, the Christian upbringing as it was described to him, you had something called fun. And Crowley discovered fun.
And he did.
And that was probably the greatest spiritual leap he made.
Because he wasn't struck by lightning.
Exactly.
Okay. And he realized that you could go out and do this. And he had been deprived of all of that for throughout his childhood and early adult life. And like I said, he wasn't struck down. He didn't die. He was still okay. And it wasn't that bad. And he just took things a step further. And right there, this is a good spot to take a break. You're listening to Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. We are talking to Tobias. Oh, and I wanted to make a comment really quick. What does Churton mean?
Churton.
Yes.
It's a place in Cheshire, and the name, we don't know exactly what it means, but it's named. I think the place is named after a family, de Churton, who came over with William the Conqueror in about between 1066 and 1100, and the family came probably from France.
I was hoping it had something to do with church, and we would be able to laugh about that.
Well, church, the technical, they say it's a church on a hill, but if you go to Churton, there is no hill and there's no church. So
there you go.
I think it's, I have a feeling it's the name originally came from North Italy or Merovingian Austrasia, but you'll lose your audience with that stuff.
Merovingian, really? All right. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. This is Fade to Black, the spoke radio for the masses. Only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. We'll be back right after this. Stay with us.
This is William from La Crescenta, and I listen to JimmyChurchRadio.com. Jimmy Church.
My name is Alan, and I listen to JimmyChurchRadio.com.
He's always giving it to you straight.
JimmyChurchRadio.com.
On the Dark Matter Radio Network. Hi, this is Rob Reiner from Anvil, and you're listening to JimmyChurchRadio.com.
What's up? I'm Chris. What up? This is Kyle Massey, and you're listening to Jimmy Church Radio, the Revolution.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Fade to Black, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Hashtag DMRadioNet is what you want to do. Go hang out with all of the Fadernauts. And I do want to remind everybody, remember, we are live every night this week. And this Friday, we are out at Contact in the Desert. It's going to be a great week here. We are live with Tobias Churton, not anything to do with church, apparently, live from England. Before the break, we were really swinging in another direction with Mr. Crowley. And with your background, and I think it's important to stress here, with your background, you should be painting the opposite picture of Aleister for us, and it appears that you are not. And where is this coming from? You know, from your background, it seems like you are not only rolling that rock uphill, and so to speak, but you know, and with your friends, and I'm certain you have a religious circle as well. And when you have a book, the Beast in Berlin, you are fighting this on all fronts. So where is this coming from?
I as I said before, I think it's partly something. I feel there's an important truth in this story that needs to be discovered by people as individuals, and that's what keeps me saying something, which I know a lot of people I know, friends, say, well, why, you know, you could be talking about William Blake all the time because Blake's acceptable. And yes, I've got a biography on Blake coming out. And I was even thinking of doing a film on John Wesley once. Can you believe that? So I'm very much interested in great spiritual figures, people who move mankind in a very profound way towards what we call the light, a more enlightened view of existence. Crowley has a real place in that. Had it not been for the fact that his reputation had been so totally mashed, so completely destroyed, so much, he was broken on the wheel of the modern media. Mm-hmm. He wasn't broken, but his reputation was. I felt on simply fair play, somebody's got to stand up and find out and project at some point the truth about this situation. Or at least the other side.
It's shocking,
but it's
for all of us.
It's
shocking for all of us, and it almost makes me want to. Is William Blake's autobiography going to be? Are you going to reveal that he was a puppy killer and a heroin addict? You know, because
I think what we're going to reveal William Blake. We're going to reveal the real Blake and his sources and his spiritual viewpoint. And we're going to wipe away the idée reçue, the lathering of romanticism in which Blake has been surrounded. He's called very much a romantic poet.
Yes.
I will go for that view. Blake is not a romantic figure. He is essentially an esoteric spiritual figure. That doesn't mean he's not sympathetic. He's not a figure of empathy to romantics, but he's not on the same step with Coleridge and Wordsworth, nature poets. He hated nature poetry and nature landscapes in certain respects, important respects. But if we want to talk about Blake, we can perhaps do that later in the year when the book comes out.
Well, and Wordsworth to me,
but one thing about Blake
boring,
is that Blake was a rebel, and Crowley was very inspired by Blake, and almost incarnates one of Blake's figures, Orc, the child of freedom and rebellion,
yes.
The fiery child, Red Orc.
Yes.
Crowley becomes that figure.
Interesting. And also Crowley's poetry, too. I don't know if you want to call it poetry.
Well, I love a lot of it. I think it's very good.
Well, what did the judge... Yeah, well, okay. When he brought the lawsuit up against the publisher for his book of poetry in London, what were the oh man, it was bad. What were the judge's comments at the end of the trial about his poetry?
That was that Justice Scrotton, Lord Justice Scrotton, or was that the other? I think he said he'd never seen anything so obscene from a man who calls himself Britain's greatest poet. But what they got out, what had happened was the lawyer for Constable had got hold of two of Crowley's early, what can you say, decadent works that he had published abroad. One
Tobias, I challenge you. I challenge you to just
these books
say
are not representative of the bulk of his poetry. I could quote, I could find you a couple of William Blake's Filth poems about defecation and so on, which do not appear in the school textbooks. But every poet probably has his moment. Crowley was doing an experimentation with decadent pornography. Out of about 20 poetry books, these were two of his very earliest ones. When he was he'd only just graduated. I think one of them he'd written when he was an undergraduate. This is just undergraduate filth. Again, if you want to, if you want to destroy a person, find out what they were doing when they were 18.
Oh yeah.
It's below the belt. If they'd actually read some of his, like the poems he dedicated to Winston Churchill, for example, find very different poet.
What I was saying was, I challenge you to say out loud the title of either of those poems, and you know what I'm talking about. And
well, there's White Stains was one, and the other was Snowdrops from a Curate's Garden.
Yeah, that's right. But that's not even the one I was thinking of. But let's let it go. But his poetry too, as well, was used against him, is what I'm saying, and he lost that lawsuit based on the content of the poetry, not if he was right or wrong in the lawsuit and the proceeds from that. Which is what he was suing for. He was suing for his royalties. And I think he was denied. I would love to, I'm fishing for your comment here. He was denied those royalties that were probably rightfully due him, just based on the content of a few poems that were read in during the court proceedings.
No, that's not true. This is the 1934 London trial, Constable versus Aleister Crowley, and the judge said that Crowley's reputation could not be damaged by the untruths which were written in Nina Hamnett's book, Naked Torso, because Crowley had built up a reputation that was inherently bad. Poor, so he couldn't be dead. So ordinary laws of libel did not apparently, according to the judge, apply in Aleister Crowley's case. Uniquely, it would appear. Only Crowley apparently could not sue for libel, because you could always persuade enough people that Crowley's reputation was undestroyed. You couldn't destroy it any more than it was already, and so people to this day, I've heard many people say, but Crowley destroyed his own reputation. But again, it really depends on what sources one consults. Crowley was well destroyed by the British establishment at that period. But again, I would say that so would Benjamin Franklin, Tom Paine, and so on. But they perhaps didn't live lives quite as colourful that we know about anyway. As Crowley always said, he didn't hide, veil not your vices in virtuous words, he would say. Veil not your vices. So he didn't try to hide anything about himself. So you get the whole thing. But as we know, when you go into the private life of any famous people, and not so famous, you would find things that a jury would find unpalatable.
With
we're all sinners, aren't we?
Yeah, right.
Was it?
With let's not go there, please. Let's not go there. So while he was at Cambridge, he started to dive into secret societies and the appeal there, which did that cause him, again, this is the myth. We're trying to separate the myth and the legend from the truth. But is that what caused him to leave Cambridge?
Well, no, he didn't leave Cambridge. He'd done his 3 years. Modern languages he was studying, history he was studying, philosophy he was studying, and he studied them. He didn't take his final exams, which wasn't unusual in those days, especially for aristocrats. People weren't so obsessed with qualifications in those days. if you'd been to Cambridge, you'd had the gentleman's education. So he left when the courses he was studying were finished. What had happened is midway through his Cambridge career, he had a kind of breakdown that he writes about, where he suddenly looked at his future as a diplomat, and he's thought, what's the point? You know, as a lot of young people do. Who's going to remember the ambassador to, you know, wherever you like, United States, in 50 years' time? Is this the way to spend a life? You know, being well used to it, obviously to a devoted ambassador, you'd say yes. But he suddenly realized that he felt called to participate in what he said was a movement that would actually affect spiritual changes in the world. And that suddenly became attractive to him. He came to realize that the history of man is actually decided on a spiritual level first, and then manifests in the organic world that we can observe and write about. And he suddenly thought that the only thing worth doing with a human life, as far as he was concerned, was to become one of the, as it were, movers and shakers of spiritual change. And that idea seized him mightily. And that's an idea I can personally understand. And if you don't understand that, or the attraction of that idea, you'll never get Crowley. He will always just appear to be seen through his manifest excesses.
Well, at this point, was this when his inheritance came into play too as well?
Yes. So at the age of 21, he inherited about £50,000, which in those days had an incredible buying power.
Would have a buying power today. It's still a big chunk of cash to a 21-year-old now. And that's what I'm referring to. Things started to change. He was looking at secret societies. I think he had his first tryst with another man, right, at this point?
That point, yeah.
Yeah, that happened in Cambridge. And his
Jerome Pollitt.
Yes. And so his views started to change. And do you think that the money, was he waiting for that inheritance so he could possibly start to run away from his past? And again, I want to separate the myth from the legend. This is what you read about. This is the sensationalism that he suddenly, got his inheritance. He was doing radical things at Cambridge. He had an insatiable sexual appetite. These are the myths. So let's separate what caused this radical change. And again, it was secret societies which were prevalent all over Europe at that point.
I don't think Crowley changed radically. I don't think Crowley changed radically at any point, except, as I say, when he decided not to devote himself to a conventional upper-class career in the diplomatic service. That was about as radical as it got. Most of his time at university was spent scaling the great mountains of the Alps, the Matterhorn, the Eiger he climbed alone, which was a remarkable achievement. He climbed the highest peaks in Great Britain and the Alps. And he was one of about three of the great climbers of the world at that time. This was his great achievement. And his poetry and his mountaineering went together. There's this aspirational, get as high as you can, literally ascend in consciousness, have the greater viewpoint is what he's after. He only joined one secret society, and it wasn't all that secret. I mean, it wasn't like some kind of criminal organization, the Tongs or something like that. If you wanted to join it, all you had to be was a Freemason and meet certain people or read their material, and you could gain access to it. They had the Order of the Golden Dawn had been founded by a group of Freemasons for an order that would involve women as well, men and women together, exploring occult science, as they would have called it in those days, and especially theosophic. They're hugely influenced by theosophy. Crowley had read a book by Arthur Waite, a journalist who was interested in sort of things I've been interested in, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, esoterica. And he'd said that there was a hidden community. He got this idea from an 18th century book, There was a hidden community who had the pinions of the world's destiny at their fingers. Crowley wrote to Waite, said, "I'm very interested in such a community. This sounds a lot better than the diplomatic service. I would be very interested in pulling the strings of the future development of man's spiritual evolution." Waite said, "Well, you can probably gain access to this through this Order of the Golden Dawn, which met at Mark Mason's Hall in London, a nice building." And so Crowley, through a mountaineering contact on one of his trips to Switzerland, met a member of that by accident, which was a wonderful accident, after a talk about alchemy. And he was introduced to the order, and he went through the order and its teachings very, very, very quickly, mastered them, and became a dominant member. Unfortunately, too dominant for its more conservative members. And he fell out with W.B. Yeats, the poet, and with Florence Farr and several other members over various issues. I think there's a lot to suggest they were rather jealous of Crowley. He was a bit too independent, a bit too outspoken, and he had his attitudes and his drive was very different to theirs. They wanted a nice, cozy little occult fraternity, carry about their rituals quietly without too much fuss. Crowley was out to change the world, I think, or the spirit of the world. Well, he saw himself as incarnating a change. He saw himself as incarnating a new zeitgeist, which was he felt was coming upon the world, which of course it was, as we know.
Wasn't he also attempting to challenge Golden Dawn and the attraction for him also, the very affluent members of Golden Dawn, and you had creative people, writers, poets, and so forth. And once he got into the Golden Dawn, didn't he? Again, I'm separating the myth from the legend and what is actually the truth here. But he wasn't happy, and he attempted to challenge. Did he ever try to take over and lead Golden Dawn too as well? Did he challenge?
No, not at all. No. What had happened was that the London membership of the order, led by Florence Farr and W.B. Yeats, fell out with the main leader of the organization, who lived in Paris, and that was Samuel Mathers.
Mm-hmm.
Crowley, who was rather Nietzschean, believed in the authority figure, and Mathers had listened to Crowley and taken him seriously, and sent Crowley as his representative back to London and said, "Look, you're going to have to accept my authority over this order." And W.B. Yeats and Farr and their friends said, no, we don't want Mathers. So they tried to get Mathers out of the picture. Crowley felt it incumbent upon him to introduce them to the facts of a magical order is not based on a democratic principle. It's based on raw spiritual authority. And Crowley alienated them even more by backing Mathers. But the whole thing split the order. And it could be argued that Crowley knew that was a likely result, that the order would split. But that is very hard to establish, whether he wanted to split the order or not. He certainly wasn't trying to become the leader of that order. His problem with it was that after 2 years of being in it, he felt the whole thing was too bourgeois, too tame, and wasn't ever going to be anything much more than an interesting talk shop.
What happened next?
Well, he was expelled from the London order, whereupon Mathers expelled the London members of the order. So there was a civil war in this organization, which didn't reflect well on anybody who was involved with it. And eventually Crowley got sick of the whole thing and left for Mexico in June 1900, and just left the whole thing behind him. He was just sick to death of it.
What did he do? What did he do while he was in Mexico? And we were talking before the program about this. I didn't know about his travels to Mexico, and apparently he went alone. I was a little taken aback, a little shocked that this part of Aleister's life has been, it's not there. I didn't know about it. And of all of the research that I've done on Crowley's background. I said Crowley, by the way. It's simply not there. So what did he do while he was in Mexico, and why?
There's a huge,
Why is it not?
amount.
Yeah, why is it not in the history books? Why did they? I don't want to say erase, but it's certainly not talked about.
Well, it is in the biographies, but perhaps it's not emphasized. Why that is, I really don't know. Whether the biographers just simply perhaps because a lot of them are English, they don't think of Mexico as in the way that, say, somebody who lives in California would think about Mexico, or somebody with a history in the United States would think about Mexico much more intimately. I think perhaps for a lot of English people, or maybe it's because what happened there they didn't feel was sensational enough. Because in fact, what Crowley did when he got there was organize expeditions to scale the highest mountains in Mexico, which he did. Some of them alone, some of them with a German friend, Oscar Eckenstein. And they scaled every great mountain in Mexico at the time. And that was what he really wanted to do. At the same time, he was of interest to various Freemasons of the ancient and accepted rite. And set up his own little order. We don't really know what happened to that, the Order of Invisible Light. And he involved himself with fringe masonry. To get a picture of this period, see the movie The Wild Bunch, Sam Peckinpah's movie. Now, if you think of the general in that Mapache, I think his name was,
yes,
and the kind of brutality that was normal in Mexico at that time, and we're talking about the period around the Mexican Civil Wars. Crowley's there at that period. It's a very, very violent time, and a large indifference to life. I think Crowley describes at one point watching a group of guys playing cards, and one of them was accused of cheating, whereupon one of them just simply put his thumbs in this man's eyes and gouged his eyes out, and nobody batted an eyelid. Nobody thought this was unusual. At that time, this sort of thing could happen. And Crowley actually fell in love with Mexico. He adored it, and its women too, if you like. He had a love affair there, which inspired one of his best love poems, I think, which wasn't read out at the trial. You mentioned, of course, they wouldn't want a Crowley that wrote tender and passionate love poetry. It's a pity, because some of his love poems are tremendous, and many a woman would be deeply flattered by them, I'm sure. But as many women were. I mean, this was another thing about Crowley, he was very popular with the ladies. He wasn't bestial. He didn't have a bestial reputation as far as the women concerned. There's some very intelligent and spiritually minded, high-minded women were involved with Crowley, artists and novelists and artistic and professional people. He attracted people.
Well, what about this reputation that he has? And we can certainly talk about this further after the break, or we can do it now. But about his sexual appetite, this 24/7 need for sex. Now, again, separating the myth from
talking about his undergraduate days. I mean, I think I felt quite like that when I was 18, 19. I don't know about you. He just happened to write about it. Well, and in that period, it was probably unusual to be so bold about it. Although Lord Byron or somebody, nobody minds Lord Byron. He's a great romantic. That's great. Don Juan, for goodness sake.
Right.
Our literature is filled with lovable Romeos. But Crowley's not supposed to be a lovable Romeo. So when he does it, it's filth. Where the others do it, it's romantic. But Crowley was a great romantic.
But no, and I'm referring to again to Sicily.
You don't like this image, do you? I get a feeling.
Well, it's funny when it comes at you from all angles for so long, and it seems to be the part of the subject that all biographers want to touch upon. Well, of course, the blood rituals and Lucifer and his books and his writings and his own religion, but it is what is written about constantly, and to alter this again, I think we're shocking a lot of people right now. That the image is quite simply he had a 24-hour-a-day sexual appetite that went all the way to the end of his days.
No, that wasn't 24 hours at all. he certainly had a very great appetite for sex. That's for sure. And the women who liked him felt the same. And that was the life. For him, that's a celebration of the life energy that makes the whole world, well, populated, frankly. What are we saying? He shouldn't have?
Well,
are you implying that this was something he should be ashamed of? Seems like it. I think I see nothing in his sexual behavior that was would be that remarkable, except that he wrote about it with candor, without hiding it.
There are 100,000 Aleister Crowley websites that now need to be rewritten, fan sites around the world. I mean, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And this is a good point to take a break. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Bespoke radio for the masses, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. And you want to follow us right now on Twitter, @JChurchRadio, #DMRadioNet. Go hang out with all of the other Fadernauts. Go jump in the sandbox. It's a good thing to do. Also, shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. We're talking to Tobias Churton, live from the UK, about Aleister Crowley and the life of Aleister Crowley. I'll be back right after this. Don't touch that mouse. We'll be back. Thanks.
Despite popular opinion, reading a book will not make you smarter.
But listening to Jimmy Church will. On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
He's always giving it to you straight.
JimmyChurchRadio.com.
On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
Erica, Brittany, Gabby, and you're listening to JimmyChurchRadio.com.
This is KJCR at JimmyChurchRadio.com.
On the Dark Matter Radio Network.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Fade to Black, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Talking to Tobias Churton out of the UK. We are live. You want to follow us on Twitter @JChurchRadio, #DMRadioNet. Shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. You can also do so over on the website. Now, we were talking right before the break, Tobias, about this image that is that you're altering right now for everybody else, the status quo on Aleister. And I had asked at the very beginning of the interview, what is the fascination in society today with Mr. Crowley? Some of it is influenced, with guys like Ozzy Osbourne and stuff. But and certainly Jimmy Page, and I did want to talk to you about that too as well. But why the attraction? Why do people write about one thing and pursue only one view of Mr. Crowley? What do they gain out of that?
Maybe book sales if they're lucky.
Album sales, sure.
Maybe they want to flirt with an energy that fascinates. But most of it's just flirting. There really are two schools, aren't there? There are those who think Crowley is the source of all evil in the modern world and somehow encapsulates everything that's gone wrong since Pleasantville fell apart in 1956 with Heartbreak Hotel and the subsequent disturbance of society through the evils of rock and roll, long hair, men that did stop looking like Clark Gable supposed to look. All of that. He's guilty, Guilty, yeah, Crowley's guilty of all that. He doesn't want you to live in Pleasantville, But if I remember the movie, nobody wants to live in Pleasantville when they're given a chance to get out of it, except the people for whom Pleasantville is reality. Now, Crowley represents freedom of thought. Dangerous thing. How can you have freedom of thought? Well, first of all, you've got to be able to think. That's the first start. Now, what Crowley wants is a nation of thinking people. Now, people with opinions always think they're thinking, but they're not. They mouth opinions. They get opinions from a place. They combine these opinions together like a brick wall, and eventually what you end up is a brick wall of opinion, and you can't get through that. There's no door. Now, Crowley and the spiritual tradition wants to continually open doors. Oh, what's behind the door? Is it something evil? Is it something dark? Is something horrible going to happen? Well, you open the door. Oh dear, look, it's light. Oh, I got enlightenment. Well, for a person who's used to living in the darkness, that's going to be quite a scary experience. It's going to hurt the eyes a bit. I think Crowley is an artist. He wants to open people's eyes in his time. And there are people doing it today in music and even a few in films, I'm told. And you are talking about an artist who's aiming to illuminate the human condition. That Crowley had predilections which to most people today are confusing is partly the result of the confusion of Crowley's reputation, which began very early in his career. His first enemies were the Cambridge University Intercollegiate Christian Union. Now, when I was an undergraduate at Oxford, I got pursued by the Intercollegiate Christian Union as well. And they would come and they would tell me that I was personally responsible for the crucifixion and that I should be very sorry about that. And I said, I am deeply sorry. It's a very sorry spectacle. But then they told me they loved me. And I said, fine, will you go out with me tomorrow? This is a girl, you know. So, well, no, I don't love you like that. I said, well, how do you love me then? Well, there's a difference between one form of love and another. I said, well, one might lead to another. You know, we might start with the attraction stuff and then get on to actually care about each other and be interested in each other's best interests. Oh, no, I wouldn't do that. That's using sex. We mustn't use that, must we? Why not? What's wrong with this sex thing? Well, that, you know, and then you get on to the basic realization that for a very large part of Christian history, mainstream Christianity has hated sex. And Crowley loved sex, so Crowley must be hated. It's really that simple.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. Fascinating. I'm sitting here listening, which goes back to your background and his background. Was it an easy? Was that parallel there for both of you? Were you compassionate as you started to unravel more of the truths about Crowley with your own upbringing and your degree and theology, which is...
Well, one thing I realized when I was studying theology at Oxford, which ought to be obvious really, but it wasn't in a way, was that the theology course at Oxford, as in Cambridge too, was designed for and administered by the churches. And so you were meant to be studying I believe the greatest subject on earth, the eternal existence of spiritual existence, life, God, the universe, everything. As they used to call it in the Middle Ages, theology was the queen of the sciences. Beyond man's rational knowledge, there is a higher level. Well, that's what I was interested in, the higher level. But what I found was that the theology was basically designed to arm priests with arguments to help them become dispensers of the religious viewpoint of those who paid for them. And it wasn't a free investigation. Whereas if you went to study perhaps chemistry or physics or mathematics, in the scientific tradition, you have the idea that, well, if you can prove something, it can be believed. If it can be proven over, you know, if it satisfies scientific criteria, then it's worth believing. Whereas in theology, you were told there were things that cannot be believed before you'd even looked at them. So when I was introduced to the subject of Gnosticism, those were not to be believed because they were heresies. And a heresy is by definition something which is not to be believed. And as a young man who was interested in climbing the scaling the heights of spiritual understanding, very ambitious young man I was, it seemed to me that in order to do that, I would have to understand what was wrong with these people. And the more I studied them, the more I found that wasn't wrong. And I began to wonder who was right and who was wrong. And then the great complex picture of Western esotericism started to grow in my mind and experience. And I began to realize that there was a great deal more to spiritual knowledge than what the churches were teaching. And that's pretty well all the churches that I was aware of. And I just began to wonder then, well, maybe, we might need what religion offers, but do we need the religion that offers it?
Interesting. And you said one other thing. You said the word paid. You had to pay for information. You had to pay for salvation. You had to pay for what religion had to offer. And that is what priests are taught. You're insinuating a money system here. And I don't want to segue too far off of Crowley, but is that I want to be very clear as to what you were saying.
If Crowley was as evil as people say he was, he would have died a rich man.
Yes. When did he run out of his money, by the way?
Very early on. By about 1913, he was no longer able to make great explorations and travel the world as he had done.
Right.
I mean, he financed his expeditions.
So so that was his period inside of the United States. So he went through the last.
By the time he got to America, I think he turned up. I think he had. I can't remember the exact figure, but it was something like £100 he had, and he had a load of books. His aim was to sell his books to a collector called John Quinn, who was a very interesting character, New York bibliophile, but he also had connections with the American Secret Service as well. And Crowley made some very interesting connections in New York, which you can read about in my biography, and great, and some would say excessive detail. So
after he left, he arrived in Berlin in 1930, and I want to talk about the intelligence network, and was that why he arrived in Berlin? And so let's pick up there. Why did he move to Berlin in 1930?
Crowley went to Berlin in 1930 for several reasons, the chiefest of which was to promote his art. He had a great friend and follower, Karl Germer, who was living in Berlin at the time, who was able to arrange over a period for Crowley's paintings to be looked at by one of the greatest modern art dealers in 20th century history, Karl Nierendorf. And Karl Nierendorf had a very highly significant a gallery in Berlin, saw Crowley's paintings, recognized immediately that Crowley was a cut above the British artists he was used to, because he did not try to imitate French styles. He had a style which blended very well with German expressionist modes, and that he took him seriously as an individual, an unusual intellect, a pioneering intellect, and he recognized that Crowley's paintings reflected that. So Crowley gave our art a last shot, you could say. I don't think Crowley ever thought that art was going to change the world, but if his art could do anything, he gave it his best shot in Berlin between 30 and 32. And he had an exhibition of 73 paintings.
I'm looking at some of his paintings here, and certainly different from what was going on in the period. I have a slight...
Not that different in Germany. If you looked at Adalbert Trillhasser or Emil Nolde or Otto Dix or Schmidt-Rottluff, Crowley fits right in there. And if you put him in an exhibition with those artists, nobody would bat an eyelid. In fact, I got a friend of mine who works at the Stedelijk Museum of Modern Art in Amsterdam to show one of these paintings to one of the experts there. I said, just cover up the signature at the bottom. And the man said, oh, yes, excellent example, expressionist art. Yes, very good example of the period, probably German, he thought. Then he took his hand away from the thing and said, the only amateurish thing about this painting is the signature. So, one man's meat's another man's poison. We're not here to discuss the merits of Crowley's art. You either appreciate it or you don't. I mean, as in any artist.
Yeah, totally. What do his paintings go for today? Is there a demand in the market?
Well, they're very hard to come by, of course, because very few have survived.
Right.
The Gestapo destroyed quite a few. The German secret police.
Is there a demand for it? I know it's just...
certainly. His price is going up all the time, and I should think when book on Berlin comes out, it may have an effect. I don't know, simply because we can now look at Crowley in terms of the history of art. One of the first reviewers of the book is Sandra Miller, who is a professor of art history in England, and she recognized that Crowley can be seen. Forget about all the myth and the excess. Crowley's there as an artist.
Have you seen any of his paintings in person?
Yes, I have. I took the trouble to go to one of the owners of about 5 of Crowley's artworks in the south of England, and a great delight it was. Yeah.
So
I didn't come back with any hex or anything.
I'm looking at
they're good, interesting paintings.
I was looking at the artwork in the background in your office there, and looking to see if there was a painting on the wall.
No, none of Crowley's. I would love a Crowley's painting, but I don't think I can afford one now.
What did he do while he was in Berlin? Did he hang out with the art crowd?
Very much. With all sorts. He hung out with everybody. Einstein, Schrödinger, the famous cat experiment, quantum physics. He was very interested in the quantum physics that was being mooted in Berlin in 3032. He was in Berlin when the neutron was discovered, and he had meetings with some of the top physicists in Berlin over that. He was fascinated by what this was telling him about the nature of the universe and how it coincided with his own views. Crowley this is one of the things I learned in the book much more vividly than when I did the biography, was what a truly modern character Crowley was. He wasn't just a reactionary figure. And when we say romantic, I don't mean that he could be described and encompassed by the term romantic. It just was an aspect of his very complex psyche. Very complex man. Very silly to try and put Crowley in any particular box. He explored practically every one you can think of, and was probably there before you or any. You know what I mean? Right. He was first up the mountain, and he saw deeply. But he hung out with film people, as Margot Lyon, the actress. He hung out with theatre people. He hung out with fun-loving people, with journalists, with artists, with everybody. He never drew lines around himself. He was available to meet and for comment, and he had an extraordinary time there, and living on a shoestring, absolute shoestring. Barely surviving. Barely surviving.
Probably that period for Berlin in the world was one of the it was a creative center, and it was a renaissance for a lot of different reasons, just like what Paris went through, and certainly New York at different times. Berlin at that time was a creative world of excess. Things were, not only with filmmaking, but art and poetry and writing, and the science community too in general. And it must have been a great time to be there, and he was.
That's really the reason he went there, I think. He said he wanted to be with the leaders of thought in the world. He wanted to hear what they had to say, and he wanted them to hear what he had to say. And that's what he wanted out of Berlin. He knew that Berlin, had it not been, of course, for the Hitler catastrophe, Berlin was the leading modern place in the world. If you wanted the new eon, as he was trying to promote, Berlin was a kind of birthplace of that. It was an Athenor of the creative. In fact, so much of the modern world that we inherit comes from Weimar Berlin. A lot of it translated to America when Hitler started persecuting Jews, freethinkers, artists, and so on and so forth. Hollywood had so much talent that came straight out of Berlin, and the art world too. And most of the paintings that he would have seen ended up in MoMA, some in rather suspicious circumstances through middlemen and so forth. So the modern world in architecture, in visual arts, and in music and film, it's sort of born in Weimar and then has to wait 20 years to start emerging in the 50s. So a lot of what we consider the modern world was already happening in Berlin in 3032. And it's just that Crowley's been taken out the picture, as it were. Everyone's heard of Christopher Isherwood. We've all seen Cabaret.
Right.
But Isherwood was a friend of Crowley. Crowley knew Isherwood. Crowley knew that scene. All the characters based on the Crowley. But Crowley is not included. He's sort of taken, as somebody said, it should be called Crowley's Berlin, not Isherwood's. I think that would be a fair point.
Yeah, exactly. And with, do you think the influence was coming from Crowley in the opposite direction, or do you think Crowley was influenced by Berlin, or was it mutual?
It was a mutual love affair. Crowley had always had a suspicion. He wrote to Germer, he says, I always felt that my work would be appreciated most in Germany. He's talking about the Weimar period, obviously. And he knew that, yes, Berlin was, I think, Crowley's last real time of freedom. I think he really let his what was left of his hair down there and had his last great fling of personal freedom. Even though it was very limited financially, but he wasn't limited from his presence and the people who loved him. And women were falling in love with him. One of them was a relative of the famous Stauffenberg, the great German martyr and hero. And she got miffed because he wouldn't sleep with her. It's an interesting story itself. So she kind of set the police onto him. He had lots of very colourful adventures which are related in the book. And they're wonderful adventures, and they've never been told before. And it will amaze and delight people. This isn't Crowley. There's no black magic. There's no blood. There's no. Perhaps people won't be interested for that reason. There's no heroin. The excesses here are the excesses of an artist in love, and it's a delight to read a mind of his order communicating with other great minds in a creative setting.
How does a guy broke arrive in Berlin and suddenly hang out with Einstein?
Einstein just lived in a loft. We now have the legend of Einstein, another legend, But Einstein in those days was just Albert Einstein. Yes, he'd made his name in physics, but you could go and see Einstein. He lived in a loft apartment in central Berlin in 1930. He had his holidays just outside, very close to where Crowley was swimming, and he was just one of the great men of Berlin intellectual life. And of course, Einstein at that period was political. He was supporting the League Against Imperialism, which was financed by the communists, by Russia, as it was a front organization. And Einstein contributed to that. And I think Crowley was probably there's evidence that he was spying on that organization's activities.
What was the magnetic? There's obviously a magnetic appeal to Aleister. If he can just, like I said, arrive not penniless, but he's just a guy. He arrives in Berlin, and suddenly he's in contact with all of the creative aspects of Berlin, all of the filmmakers and writers, and he was right there. And not everybody can do that. So there was a magnetism that was drawing in. Because, look, if I went to Berlin broke, I'm not hanging out. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
And
I think to say he was broke would be too emotive. He was living on an irregular stipend.
You can say what you will, but there was something. He
wasn't on the streets, He wasn't. He was living, as it were, on the streets in the general sense.
Right.
I.e., he was in contact with the reality. He was being funded at the time by Carl Germer, or more particularly Carl Germer's wife Cora, who came from a wealthy family in New York, and lent him money for a publishing. This was the other main reason to be in Germany. Carl Germer was trying to establish a Crowley publishing organization.
You're touching on Tobias. You're touching on exactly what I am saying. He had the ability to attract all of this.
Yeah.
How did he pull it off? What was it about this guy that he could go and do? It seems like he could do whatever he wanted, hang out with whoever he wanted, and survive and move along. And
Jimmy, he was a magician. That's what magicians of any caliber are supposed to do.
Was he doing spells? Yeah. Was it a spell? Was it a chant? Did he know something that you and I don't?
Well, he probably did. I think he knew an awful lot that we don't. Yes, I do. He'd studied the occult sciences in India in depth. He'd been to Burma. He was extremely familiar with some very profound psychological truths. and things that he didn't talk about them loosely to people, only if they were seriously interested. Otherwise, he would appear as a joker or as a nice gentleman, very often a sort of kindly uncle figure, really. The only people who were afraid of him were people who had cause to be afraid of him because they were pretentious people who didn't want to get found out. Those are the people who were most afraid of Crowley, were people who set their store on their money, not on their character, people who set their value on external things. Those people were afraid of Crowley because he had spiritual insight and he could expose them, and he had great wit, and he did alienate a lot of rich people because of that. Nina Hamlet remarks on this, that he would have been much better off if he could have resisted taking them down, taking rich and powerful people down a peg or two. But he was a magician. He was practicing a form of sexual magic, which is strange expression. What do you mean by sexual magic? Well, for him, sexual practices could be a sacrament. A sacrament means taking something ordinary or natural in life, like bread, and raising it to a higher level. And in the words of Coleridge, disembodying the soul of fact. So you have an ordinary thing like sex is very ordinary. Everybody, going on all the time, nothing extraordinary about it at all. So it's a normal part of human life. You can take this normal part of human life and you can raise it to a higher level. And Crowley did that. And he practiced a form of sexual magic, which is described carefully in the book. But it's not something that will be understood at all by most people. I think it wasn't meant to be. It's an initiatic kind of understanding. I would say, for example, that somebody whose soul is in love with God, so long as we think of God in a big enough way, i.e., not something we can conceive of rationally. That person with that mentality is going to have a very different experience of sexuality to an ordinary person who is merely thinking of it in the immediate motor neuron, I want it,
Right. With all of his contacts that he had in Berlin with various people in levels and different aspects of society, were those references, do those come from his own diaries, or did anybody else refer to historically meeting and talking with Crowley from the other direction? Did he influence somebody else, and did they write about it and comment about?
Yes, I found letters from a lady called Bertha Busch, who he met in Berlin. She was a sort of businesswoman. She'd run a club for a famous actor, a German actor at the time. And she wrote to Goethe about him, and what she has to say is fascinating. She said, "I don't think he's a god, but he's basically he's one hell of a man, and the poor man has so few real friends, and they let him down all the time." Very different, interesting side to the story. Goethe's own letters to and from Crowley are very important, but the first thing that you start with is a newspaper report. When he first arrived, a man he went to see called Hans Steiner, who was a painter, an artist and set designer, rang up one of the best journalists on the Berliner Tageblatt, one of the main daily papers. There are many daily papers in Berlin, but this was one of the most significant ones. And the reporter came and did a story, and there was this wonderful story appeared with a drawing of Crowley by Augustus John, a wonderful drawing. And he presents Crowley as a kind of figure that German intellectuals and artists would find very attractive, as a man who traveled the world, who'd investigated the deeper aspects of spiritual practices around the world, who climbed mountains, who was an adventurer, but also a poet and an artist. And he'd come to Berlin, and aren't we amazed? Here's another interesting visitor to Berlin. And Crowley did have some reputation in Europe because the previous year, in 1929, the French government, for reasons which are still not entirely explained, had rescinded Crowley's carte de séjour and basically said, get out of town, if you would, giving us the reason, yet again, echoing Mussolini, that he was too sexually dangerous to have around.
There's a response there, but I'm just going to let that go. If if you don't mind.
They can't all be wrong. Don't tell me.
Yeah, right.
They can't all be wrong.
You know what? Where there's smoke, there's fire. That's how I'm going to answer that.
There's certainly fire.
This is Fade to Black on the Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, talking to Tobias Churton live from the UK. When we come back, we're going to do our last little segment with Tobias, and I'm going to ask Tobias about some of the modern sides of Aleister and The View. And what I mean by that, you'll find out when we come back. Shoot me an email to jimmy@jimmychurchradio.com. You do want to follow us on Twitter @jchurchradio. I am trying to get all of your questions in. We'll be back. More with Tobias right after this. Stay with us, everybody.
This is KJCR at jimmychurchradio.com.
On the Dark Matter Radio Network. Hey, this is Alan Johannes from the Vultures and Queens of the Stone Age. You're listening to jimmychurchradio.com. Rock on.
All right, everybody, welcome back. Fade to Black, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. This is bespoke radio for the masses. Tobias, before the break, I said that I wanted to lean and get into some of the more modern sides, and I do want to talk about Jimmy Page and Aleister. So let's get to that in a second. But one of the things that is written about so much about Crowley is the Abramelin. And his addiction may or may not be the right word, but his fascination with it and the length of this ceremony, what is its intention, bad or good, and the fact that when he left Sicily, he searched far and wide all over the UK for a specific house where he could perform this ritual. What is the Abramelin, and is that part of Aleister's life, that part of Aleister's legend, even true? Is that why he moved to Loch Ness?
Well, he certainly didn't go to Loch Ness after Sicily. Sicily was in the 20s. This all began in 1898. Crowley's interest in the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage is to give it its proper title. The Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage is a book that was falsely dated to the 15th century. Was supposed to be the work of a magician, a Jewish magician, Abraham, called Abraham, not to be confused with the biblical character. The book actually seems to be an early Rosicrucian work, so it comes from Germany in the early 17th century. The point about the book is that it promises something quite specific and unusual in the history of magic. It purports to give a system whereby the magician may make the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, and that once he has done this, he becomes, as it were, immune to the negative forces of the world, and is able to pursue his will with great spiritual strength and support. Now, Aleister Crowley, this is one of the first things he did as a graduate. Having not got a degree, but having certainly done the work for a degree, what Crowley wanted was a real degree. A real degree, not like a Masonic degree where if you turn up, go through the ritual, you say a few words, you get a degree. He wanted to attain something. Crowley wanted to attain the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel. What is a holy guardian angel? Now, if I said it is a romantic way of describing the Pythagorean psychic non-ego, I probably will have left most people behind. What one has got to imagine, and it is a very difficult thing to grasp for a lot of people, is the idea that the human personality, what we are as we commonly call the ego, is a kind of projection into this world of three dimensions, obvious dimensions, from a spiritual level. So I could talk about if I was talking from a higher level, I could talk about myself as Tobias this, Tobias that, and think of Tobias as an objective presence in the world. But there's a sort of a higher thing going on. Now, most people have what's commonly called a superego, somebody looking down on their own behavior and say, well, that was a bad day, Tobias, or that was a rotten day, Jimmy. You can do better than that. We talk to ourselves. In the Rastafarian cult, they'll say I and I. There are kind of two eyes having a dialogue. Well, the Holy Guardian Angel is not one of those eyes. The Holy Guardian Angel is not ego at all. It is not frankly, of this world. I think it is a colorful term for that aspect of the individual human being beyond the conditions of time and space. So you would think that to make conversation, i.e. to have access to this level, would be a very, very powerful tool in the armory of any individual, whether they call themselves a magician or not. But we must remember Crowley wants every suitable person to be a magician, somebody who is in charge properly of their own existence and familiar with the depth and height of what human being really is. We're living, according to the magical doctrine, in a very narrow world indeed. We take its limits for absolute limits, whereas in fact they're only partial limits. We take our horizon as an absolute horizon, whereas in fact only a relative horizon. We are, from the magical perspective, not alive at all. We're really spend most of our lives in a kind of sleep. We're half dead, in fact. And much of the evil of the world is, we can say, due to a complete contraction of perspective, caring only about the immediate, the obvious. Now, the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel is the road to becoming a cosmic human being. Man as it were, God intended, if you like, the primal Adam, who's recovered his place in the universe, from which we have sunk in the magical doctrine. Now, did Crowley achieve this? He said he did, and it took years. It took till 1906, in fact. And in 1906, after a tour of the Far East, Crowley began invoking his Holy Guardian Angel on a walk across southern China, an extraordinary walk of enormous courage, which he undertook with his wife and his daughter, his first daughter. And every step of that, he turned his mind into a kind of magical temple and would invoke the Holy Guardian Angel. And he did this dutifully day after day after day on the Rosicrucian principle, invoke often. And for anyone to do this, frankly, I think Israel Regardie wrote about it, for anyone to even conceive of getting on this path and going through with it over many years, enormous discipline. Very, very few people could do it. But the breakthrough occurred in a hotel in the south of England. And if this was an ordinary religion, they'd probably be worshipping there now. But actually, the Lansdowne Hotel's been knocked down. But anyway, Crowley had the breakthrough. He got a vision of the Holy Guardian Angel. And that never entirely left him. There was always a way beyond what he'd call Aleister, or he'd write it of himself as AC or Little Aleister. And he realized that the ego Aleister, which is the one most people are talking about, was practically an idiot most of his life, as we all are, viewed from a higher perspective.
Sure.
And he began to see his own shenanigans and his own duplicities and his own way he negotiated existence in ways that were not very edifying, in the way that we all make excuses for everything we do. We've always got a reason why we do it. Was it Jean Renoir said, everyone has his reasons, whether it's Jack the Ripper or President Bush. Sorry, I wouldn't mention politics, but that you can cut that out if you want. But everybody has his reasons. The Palestinians have their reasons. The Israeli government everyone has their reasons. But what nobody will consider is what is beyond the reasonable. What belongs to the unrational, That's what interested Crowley. Not the irrational, which he's often accused of, but the unrational, that which ordinary reason cannot grasp. The Holy Guardian Angel has to do with that. It's a very colorful, very romantic way of acquiring higher perspective, higher intelligence. At one point, he identifies the Holy Guardian Angel with the unconscious of Carl Jung, which is, Carl Jung had a similar idea. The conscious mind, the person we think we are, is like the tip of a gigantic iceberg. And all we know is the bit around the tip. We're not even aware of who we are. So the essence of this magic, which is real spiritual magic, not stage magic, or I'm going to turn that into an ostrich, or I can make a banana turn into an apple. This is kid stuff. All Crowley's system is based on the fundamental rules of nature and accepting that there are aspects of nature which we do not understand. That was really what drove Crowley. So in a way, even though the actual attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel took up only 8 years of his life specifically, and most of that was in two small parts of his life. It is, in fact, the bigger story of his life, because, in fact, his whole life was, in a way, dedicated to this idea of contacting supernal being, or in Kabbalah, you'd say Kether, the crown, the source, what commonly, but so misleadingly, is often called God, because God is always a projection of what we know, not an understanding of what we do not know.
With this ceremony of the Abramelin, the history will certainly say that it is one of the most difficult rituals. Almost nobody completes it. It's a labor. You have to, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, like you've been doing all night, by the way.
It's what I'm here.
You are. It's the one ritual that you need to be careful of. You don't really want to complete this. You are contacting a seriously dark entity, you're
in danger of contacting a seriously light entity.
Again, and this is what history wants us to believe about Aleister and his pursuit of this ritual. And which is why he bought the mansion on Loch Ness. Am I correct?
Yes. Mansion may be too grand a word. The Boleskine house it was a bungaloid. I mean, it's a single story building. It's larger than substantial, but by mansion would suggest the life of aristocracy.
Okay,
this would be more like an elaborate hunting lodge.
But he certainly bought the property to complete this ritual, correct?
He paid twice what it was worth financially, because it was worth so much to him spiritually.
And why did he buy the house specifically?
Well, I think he loved Scotland. He loved that part of Scotland, but he was looking for certain vistas, capacity to build a temple there. He would never be disturbed, because Loch Ness had all sorts of stories. There was local superstition around Loch Ness even then, and people tended to pass by, especially when he was there. People tended to pass by on the other side. He wanted seclusion. He wanted solitariness. Had he been born in California, he'd have probably gone out into the desert, and done a Jim Morrison.
Right. Well, also architecturally, the house needed to fulfill some specific needs with the ritual too, as well.
Yeah, it had to have an opening. There was a need for a temple that would open onto a veranda, which he had carefully paved with sand. And yes, it fitted his needs. Crowley always seemed to find the right house for a magical purpose right through his life. He always had a powerful intuition, led him to the right place. And he did live at Boleskine quite happily for a few years, but actually a very small part of his life.
Oh, and what was the need for the sand on the veranda? I find this totally interesting.
I think we're sort of talking sort of Zen kind of idea there. Is trying to create a kind of purified space. So think of the desert. You think of the desert as a purified place with the sun, burning up all impurities. The idea of a sand is that idea. It's just sort of something that suggest a spiritual purity. I think that's what the idea is.
And what part of the ritual?
But you don't actually, I mean, Crowley realized later you don't have to do all of the complex ritual stuff that's in the original text to actually get the result. But trying to do that gets your mind in the right kind of gear for the process. That is his thinking on it. So a lot of things in magic you're asked to do quite bizarre, but they're actually about a sort of mental training. So in themselves they may be of no value, but the collective process of going through a ritual sets off subconscious activity, should we say. But actually he never completed. He was distracted totally from the Abramelin at Boleskine by the problems in the Golden Dawn, and he left it completely in 1900, went back down to London, was very annoyed that he hadn't completed it, very annoyed because he'd invested a huge amount of money in it, but he put his resources behind Mather's struggle with the London Order, for which he thought was the spiritually right thing for him to do at the time. So he was very, very upset about not. A lot of people said, this was Crowley's problem. He abandoned the Abramelin,
right?
And the suggestion is that he failed. And because he did, he had evoked demon servitors who would then torture him for the rest of his life. Well, that's Dennis Wheatley stuff. It's fictional idea of what's going on. The idea of Abramelin is to subdue, to get to know, but also to put in their place the lower parts of the human mind.
Well,
you could say it's really a form of psychology, it's a parapsychology because it presumes that there are spiritual powers, whereas conventional psychology, unless you get into certain areas of Jungian psychology, doesn't want to mention spiritual powers because you'll be dismissed as being unscientific.
With the Abramelin, you had to, and again, I need you to correct me if I'm wrong, but you had to get up every single day at a certain time of was it at night? You had to do this at night?
Well, no, most of the things were done in the day, but I remember when in some aspects, the opposition to some of the ritual work he was doing was so great that he felt the room was becoming darker and darker. It became an oppressive atmosphere.
But it was
he had to evoke demonic entities as part of it. I mean, that's pretty terrifying. I wouldn't like to do that. Would you?
No.
He was prepared to follow the ritual on that basis. He's a bit. If you think of the story in the Bible, Jesus goes into the wilderness and he's tempted of Satan. He has to deal with Satan. He has to cope with the presence of the tempter, i.e., the darker part of his character, the potential to use this spiritual energy for bad things. And the tempter tempts the initiate. So he says, well, if you do what I say, you could use all this power and change the world at a stroke. All you got to do is fly off the temple, or you could turn stones into bread, or do some miracles that would impress the ignorant. So that kind of idea is at work in the Abramelin story. So it's a dangerous form of spiritual magic because it's so total. It's dealing with man's relation to his own soul, in an absolute sense, and that would be dangerous for anybody to enter into that process lightly.
And with the Abramelin, it's not a ritual that you kick back one evening with your friends and you get it over and done in an hour or two. That's no joke. No, it's no joke.
Complete commitment.
Commitment. And he spent how many months on this before he stopped?
Oh, it was over 18. It started in 1898 through parts of 1899. So he was probably at work on it. I'm estimating. I haven't added up every month, but it was about a year initially. But he went back to it later.
And that's what everybody needs to understand. This wasn't some ritual. That it was a commitment, a serious commitment, part of your life that he had to do and engage in every single day, like you just said, for a year. And he never did complete it, did he?
No, he did complete, as I say. He completed
at the mansion, at
Boleskine. No, he had to leave it in the middle of the process, which troubled him, and he wasn't able to take it up again until after he'd been to Mexico, and then he'd been to America, been to California and San Francisco, and then he went to the Far East, then he went across India, and he didn't resume it until after his marriage. He got married in 1903, and then, of course, that was a huge distraction, so he couldn't do it then, and he didn't really get going again until he took his family to the Far East. And then after meeting up with his old friend Alan Bennett, who was a Buddhist monk at a Buddhist monastery in Burma, it sets the whole thing up. Alan Bennett said to him, you've really got to find out who you are, Aleister. Bennett was one of the first Western Buddhists actually at work in a monastery. So we're talking in the year 1905 at this point. And Crowley always listened to everything Alan Bennett told him with great humility. And said, if Alan believes it, it must be true. Right. And as he's going through the jungle, through North Burma, cutting his way through, and eventually into South China and then across China, he starts doing the Abramelin in his brain, in his imagination, in his spirit, as we would say at one time. And then he goes through the whole thing right through until the breakthrough, well, in fact, nearly 2 years later.
And what happened? What happened when he finally completed the ritual?
Well, he was in a kind of beatific state. Have you ever? What's that wonderful old phrase? Renaissance. He enjoyed the beatific vision for days. He was in a state of complete bliss, unbroken, extraordinary bliss. A completely different sense of his own being, exalted, spiritual, insightful. You know, he suddenly understood the Bible. He understood the essence of religion, and it wasn't discursive knowledge, wasn't argumentative knowledge, wasn't facts and knowledge of that kind. It was a spiritual understanding, he was swimming in a divine consciousness.
Do you think?
And this went on for some days. His diaries at that point are fascinating because they're very matter of fact as well. I mean, he's not kidding you. He's not one of these people who yeah, I went in the desert and something happened, man. You know, I mean, what was it? What was it, Jim? Well, it was. You know, I mean,
right.
This wasn't some AirSats weekend acid trip. He'd achieved what holy men, so-called holy men, of course, are those who just realize how unholy they are.
Is it your belief that he did make contact with something,
with the
Orgo-Ides?
Not something, himself? I mean, the Holy Guardian Angel is the ultimate spiritual dimension that projects into this world as the person we know. So, but what are the limits of such a being? Whether Holy Guardian Angels are shared or they're collective, we do not know. This isn't on a level that we're not talking about objects here. You know, somebody said, God is not an object of our knowing. It's not something you can put under a microscope. It's not an object at all. It is dimension free.
So
we are talking about in Iamblichus, one of the great Neoplatonic philosophers, talks about the Orgo-Ides, which means the dawning.
Yes.
And it is a dawning of absolute consciousness.
And which is where I was going. So it wasn't, history wants you to believe that he was attempting to make contact, okay?
In the surveillance sense.
But it is actually with
science fiction, yeah.
Right, but the contact was with oneself, with your own id, with your own consciousness.
Not the id in the Freudian sense at all. Freud's id is almost nothing at all. No, this is a divine being.
I got you. And so no darkness then. And you're letting everybody down. You know, he didn't make contact with, some satanic dark entity that was going to give him some secret to mankind or the end of the earth. That isn't what happened.
Man as he ordinarily is the satanic dark entity. There's plenty of that. Watch the news. You want to see some satanic dark entities. And they all look like you and me, funnily enough, don't they? But they sit there and they make orders to bomb this and shoot that and, remove this. No, there's enough. You want satanic dark entities, look around you.
You don't look so evil to me.
You know what I'm saying? I hope.
I
think people, the trouble is that we still, for all our modernity, as Crowley understood, we're still living in the Middle Ages where spiritual things are concerned. We still really suspect maybe there are little demons with horns that look like Pan with tridents poking and all that. We still seem to think that, of course our imaginations can create this. If you take enough if you're psychotic or take overly stimulated, the imagination can create every kind of visual horror. We know. How real those are, well, to the individual, they can be very real indeed. But we associate that with psychic breakdown. Crowley isn't psychic breakdown. Crowley is psychic integration.
We're at the end of the program, and again, I want to thank you, but I do want to talk about something that you had brought up earlier in the show. I think I even brought it up earlier than that, which is, how society is attracted to Aleister. And then we have a very, probably regarded as one of the greatest guitar player, musicians, songwriters ever, Jimmy Page. He turns around and seeks out and purchases the property on Loch Ness. And now, if Aleister hadn't have owned that home, Page wouldn't have bought it. Okay,
yeah, right.
Agreed. What?
Yeah, sure.
So, what was the attraction there for Page, and why did he pursue it like he did? And he did pursue it.
Well, I want to say you'd have to ask Jimmy what his real feelings were about that. I could only guess, and my guesses wouldn't be worth tuppence. We know that Jimmy Page has a very serious philosophical affinity with Aleister Crowley, the real Aleister Crowley, I suspect, from all the things I've ever read that he's mentioned. And I haven't read much of his thoughts on Crowley. I don't know if there is much to read. Most of it's written about Page and Crowley, not the reality.
Right.
I think he was in a position in the 60s after the New Yardbirds to invest in property, whether it was, you could buy Crowley books quite cheaply in London at that time, first editions. Timothy Darsh Smith, who's somebody I know, used to deal books to Paul McCartney and Jimmy Page in St. John's Wood. And Timothy Darsh Smith has written about Crowley and collects Crowley work. So I think it started with collecting Crowley's books and then maybe Crowley's paintings or drawings. And obviously when the chance came to have Crowley's house, he probably thought, I imagine he just thought, well, why not? I can afford it, and it could be interesting. It could be very interesting. Maybe did he want to practice Crowley magic? I honestly don't know, and I really don't. Has he ever said he did? Do you know?
No, well,
did he?
I can't go there. I can't. I could, but I can't, and I won't, and I'm sure
I get the feeling that Jimmy Page understands perfectly well that if he puts his head above the barricades and says, "Hey, I think Aleister Crowley's great," and it's been a big inspiration for my life, he knows that he knows perfectly well that people will think he's mad or something. If an academic or a writer or scholar like myself studies it, it's different because I'm studying it and I'm not advocating a point of view in the sense of I want people to believe me. I'd like people to investigate objectively for themselves if they feel able to.
Were you ever able to interview or speak with anybody that met Crowley?
Yes, I've spoken to his grandson.
And
yeah.
Well, I mean,
most interesting.
I wanted to ask you this question earlier. You would have to assume that 60 or 70 years have gone by since his death now. So, anybody that would have known him or have spoken to him would have passed on by
terrible.
now.
Yes, that's a sad thing. And I had, when I was much younger, there were a few opportunities. There were people left alive. Then one could have. I wish I'd spoken to. I remember when I was in Berlin in 1987. My friend and I were going to go and see a man who probably had known Crowley in Berlin, and I really wanted to. And he was away. It turned out we went to his bookshop. He was away. Mr. Tchaikovsky, I think his name was. He was away that week, so we didn't get to see him. But no, authentic contact with Crowley is pretty rare these days. I mean, one of the most interesting people was Grady McMurtry, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Korean War and decorated American soldier, who'd also fought in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, a decorated hero of the American Army, who Crowley wanted to take up his organization on his death, after the death of Carl Germer, who did take over from Crowley as head of the Ordo Templi Orientis. And Grady McMurtry revitalized the OTO in 1969 and really got it going again, finally doing what Crowley had asked him to do in 1944. I've seen the letter where Crowley says, you could be... Oh, it's a wonderful letter. Crowley said something very interesting. He writing this in the middle of World War II, and he said, 1965 will be a very interesting year in the era for the child, meaning the new eon. 1965. What an extraordinary thing to suddenly write. And there it is in a letter in 1944. And of course, it's the year of, Beatlemania and the Great Change and the 60s consciousness. The Byrds starting to jangle the guitars, and Tambourine Men and Bob Dylan and miniskirts and all of that stuff that has a sort of new aeon, infantile, childish, innocent but knowing complexity about it that has shaped all of us, and why you've probably, like the music you do at a guess, I don't know. If you mention Jimmy Page, if you find Jimmy Page acceptable, then you've been touched by that era of the eon of the child, as Crowley called it. Now, I think that's the attraction for the rockers. It's the eon of the child, and that rock and roll is based on a kind of recovery of innocence. Eldridge Cleaver, I think it was, black radical, said, I think, that rock and roll gave the whites back their bodies. I remember John Lennon quoting that.
Yes.
But he also, with the rock and roll, came a certain amount of magic. What is rock and roll but a kind of ritual, in fact? It's based on a repetitive beat, which creates a kind of slightly hypnotic, traveling sort of feeling. It manifests itself in bodily movement, and the aim is euphoria. So it's a sort of a rather simple sort of musical magic, and it works for some people and deafens others. I can't, but I think that's a lot of the attraction of Crowley for the rock and roll people who were interested in Crowley. Was many of them are frustrated philosophers. The great era of rock was filled with these rather clever rockers from the art college. They weren't the sort of working class boys from the south of America as in the 50s. In the 60s, you get people coming out of UCLA and universities and colleges in London with a more intellectual feel and grasp of rock and roll. And Crowley kind of fits into that because Crowley has sort of intellectual aspects, and he also represents a kind of liberation and a freedom. And also this aeon of the child, recovery of an innocent consciousness, undercutting all the what they call the man's view.
Right.
You got to go to Vietnam, son, and die for your country. No, you should go and kill for your country, whatever it is. All of that stuff. The revolt against the inevitability of war and horror that you find this, because Crowley would have been sympathetic to much of that, though he would have hated the hippie lack of discipline. But a lot of the hippies, were quite disciplined. I remember an interview with Peter Coyote, you may know, one of the diggers in San Francisco, and as they call themselves. And it seemed to me that there were hippies and hippies, and there were freaks, and they weren't all loose living. It wasn't all like Easy Rider, not knowing how to plant corn out in the desert. So yeah, I think the Crowley rock and roll connection is fascinating. Will probably go on because the music will.
And I have to say, thank you. This was an absolute fascinating conversation, and I want to let everybody know all of your books are available. Everything is on your link on our website, going back to tobiaschurton.com. Everything is there, and fascinating, eye-opening conversation. And it tends to happen every single night on this show, but tonight was, like I said, all email forwarded to Tobias Churton. I have to thank you, sir, and looking forward to you coming back on with us.
Fascinating for me too. Thank you very, very much, Jimmy. That's great.
All the best. Thank you, Tobias.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Tobias Churton, everybody. Thank you, Tobias, live from the UK. Man, it did it last night, doing it again tonight. I hope they don't learn to run away when Jimmy's calling to come on the show. That means 3:30 in the morning. And you know what? Right now there, it's what, 3:30, 4:30, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning. Thank you, Tobias. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, only on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Follow us on Twitter at JChurchRadio, hashtag DMRadioNet. Shoot me an email right now to Jimmy at JimmyChurchRadio.com. Man, we're winding this one down. I'll be back right after this. Stay with us.
Here, and you are listening to my boy Jimmy Church on JimmyChurchRadio.com.
Despite popular opinion, reading a book will not make you smarter.
But listening to Jimmy Church will. On the Dark Matter Radio
Oh, man. My brain hurts. Oh. Ooh. Fade to Black. Man, I gotta tell you, I needed a long drink. Man, thank you, Tobias. Fascinating show. And guess what, everybody? So, trying to talk, tweet, and listen and stay engaged all at one time is a tough thing to do. You could tell when I was slowing down and typing at the same time. Anyway, guess who called right at the end of the interview? I almost picked up, but it was Dino. Dino called in. Anyway, wow. This is the thing with what just went down. And I know, I was tweeting, and it wasn't really combat, but what it was, I have studied in fascination Crowley, now that I know it's Crowley, for years. And when you think when you think you know something, and you research and you read the same material over and over again, and it gets ingrained, and you don't move into new territory, and you don't find out new things. It's regurgitated, and no matter where you go, and a lot of writers and so forth will share from other writers. You know what I mean? And it's just a repetitive thing. And but what happens with that is it stays with you. And so, talking to Tobias tonight, it was like every single thing that I said, I was challenged on. And it forced me to push the issue. And I hope I was gentle. I mean, he's a really great guy, very educated guy, very cool guy, too, by the way. And I was actually running video for the interview, so in one direction from him. And looking at him, he's an educated guy. He's sitting in this nice office with exactly what you would imagine coming from a guy like that. And, he's coming from such a position of research and of intellect that, I had to fight back. Was I gentle? Did I? I think in the end it all wound down to be very cool. But man, challenged, and it just made me scratch my head. There were a couple of questions, by the way, I want to address. I was watching Twitter, not only that, but with email. The question of light and dark, not only for Crowley, but for Tobias. It was kind of weird, and I tried to get it worked into the conversation, and I didn't quite get it pulled off. I'm almost inspired to write an email to him, but yeah, So for everybody out there, is the image of Aleister changed? This is the thing. This show is about learning, and I'm here to learn. I'm here to learn, and if you guys are sitting here right with me on one side of me and on the other, and listening to this kind of conversation, are you learning something? And this is the thing. Now you go and do a little bit of research, but my question to everybody is this: has your image changed when you go and see these evil representations of Aleister, the hardcore? The question of children came up so many times, and I can't. I honestly, and please don't think any less of me, but I have a hard time saying those things or thinking those thoughts, let alone saying them. I have strong issues with that. But going there, does your image change? I mean, is it possible that all of it was just built up into legend? Has it all been built up into myth? I'm looking at Brad right here in Twitter. He says, nope, no change at all. And, I want to give old Hal a hug now. And I think I even tweeted earlier on, the picture of Crowley dancing in the daisies with a bunch of leprechauns and fairies, singing romantic songs of years gone by, pollutes the mind. But is it because we have been bombarded with a negative, harshly negative? I mean, seriously, Crowley is the guy. In this one documentary, they go to his villa in Italy and in Sicily, and they go in, and there's all these paintings on the wall that Crowley supposedly, allegedly, had painted himself on the wall with some very foul language painted over the painting, and that's where he would force people to do, not force, I mean, it was part of a ritual, but to do things that were very, very foul. And while they were looking at this painting, that's the story. And you look at this painting, and no matter what, the guy that painted that, whoever he was, and if it was Crowley, it comes from a very, very, very dark place. So, what... I don't know. I don't know. But, man, what a show. What a fascinating conversation. And quite frankly, it could have gone on forever. And I want to bring him back on. I would love to bring him back on and wrap this up. All right, everybody. So check it out. We're winding down. Oh, Rita, by the way, tonight, everybody is visiting a relative of ours in the hospital who is in a bad spot, and so that's where she is tonight, and it is a family member, and so our thoughts are out there. Rita, I did talk to her briefly during the last break. She's still there. She's been there for 5 hours tonight. So there you go. All right, tomorrow night it'll be a kinder, gentler show. Tomorrow night it will be Norio Hayakawa. Norio, the OG UFO researcher. Looking forward to it. Thank you, everybody. Questions were great tonight. I hope I got them all in. I really do. I did my best. It was engaging at the very least. Thank you, everybody. Coming up next is Skywatchers Radio with your host, our good friend, Angel the Jackal Espino. Rumor has it that he narrated The Shining 2.0. I want to know if that's the truth. Special thanks to Keith Rowland and Art Bell. Fade to Black's executive producers, Rita Kamarian. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm and Mark D. Kovar. The announcers are Steve Harder and Mark D. Kovar. Music is this guy right here, Nancy Burns. His name is Doug Aldrich. That's right, and he can spank the plank. Show intros performed by Spaceboy on the road. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Dark Matter Radio Network. I am your host, Jimmy Church, and we will see you tomorrow night with Norio Hayakawa right here, same place, same time. Be safe, everybody. I'll get a couple more tweets in. See ya.